Welcome, and thank you for joining Background Historian for this new journey. Tonight, we begin a long voyage through one of the most remarkable experiments in human history, the Roman Republic. For nearly 5 centuries, Rome was governed not by kings or emperors, but by a republic, a system of checks and balances, of fierce debates, of wars abroad and struggles at home, of glory and crisis in equal measure. The Roman Republic rose from humble beginnings. In the late 6th century BCE, Rome was a small city on the banks of the Tiber, one of many competing powers in central Italy. Its kings had ruled with pomp and power, until tyranny brought them down. In their place, the Romans created something bold and new, a government where no single man would ever hold absolute power again. They built a senate of elders, elected magistrates, and assemblies of citizens. They divided offices so that power was shared, limited, and checked. They did not yet have democracy as we understand it, nor equality for all, but what they created was unique, and it would shape the destiny of the Mediterranean. Over centuries, this republic expanded from a single city-state to a power that controlled Italy, then Carthage, then Greece, then the Eastern kingdoms. Along the way, it fought wars of survival, endured invasions and disasters, and overcame enemies as formidable as Pyrrhus of Epirus and Hannibal of Carthage. Its soldiers marched farther and farther from home, carrying the Roman eagle across seas and mountains. Its generals grew powerful, its politics bitter, its citizens divided. And yet, in that long story of struggle, the Republic laid the foundations of empire, law, and culture that would outlast it by millennia. In tonight's episode, we will tell that story in detail. We will see how the Republic was born out of rebellion, how it endured the tension between patricians and plebeians, how it created a flexible system of alliances across Italy, and how it fought the great Punic Wars against Carthage. We will follow the rise of figures like the Gracchi, Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar, men whose ambition tested the limits of republican government. We will hear of reforms and betrayals, of farmers and soldiers, of triumphs and tragedies. And finally, we will watch as the Republic, having conquered the world, could no longer govern itself, collapsing into civil war and giving birth to the Roman Empire. The Roman Republic is not only history. It is a mirror. Its debates about power, corruption, inequality, and liberty echo into our own time. To study it is to see both the potential and the peril of human government. So settle in. Let the story unfold slowly, like the turning of centuries. This is the story of the Roman Republic, the rise, the reign, and the fall of the system that shaped the Western world. The story of the Roman Republic begins with the fall of a king. To the Romans themselves, this moment was a turning point so profound that they measured all later history from it. Before 509 BCE, Rome had kings. After 509 BCE, it would have none. Out of rebellion, violence, and resolve, the Romans forged a new system, a republic where power would be shared, limited, and contested. To them, this was not only political change, it was liberation, the moment when Romans swore never again to be ruled by the arrogance of a single man. Tonight, we step into that moment. We will meet Rome's last monarch, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, remembered as Tarquin the Proud. We will see the legendary outrage that sparked rebellion, the tragic story of Lucretia. We will walk with Brutus and the Roman nobles as they swore an oath to banish kingship forever. And we will watch as the Republic's first institutions took shape, fragile but determined, at the dawn of a new age. Rome under the kings. In its earliest centuries, Rome was a monarchy. The kings, according to tradition, were 7 in number, beginning with Romulus, the city's mythical founder, and ending with Tarquin the Proud. Whether these 7 kings truly reigned as described is debated by historians, but for the Romans, they represented stages in the city's early growth. The kings were lawgivers, builders, and warriors. Romulus created the Senate and the first legions. Numa Pompilius was said to have founded Rome's priesthoods and rituals. Servius Tullius reformed citizenship and built the first great city walls. The kings ruled not only as monarchs but as religious leaders, embodying the authority of the gods. By the late 6th century BCE, Rome was no longer a small village on the Tiber. It was a growing city, influenced by Etruscan culture, trading with Latium and beyond. Its kings had power, wealth, and ambition. But with Tarquin the Proud, power curdled into tyranny. Tarquin the Proud. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus seized the throne through violence. According to Roman tradition, he murdered his father-in-law, King Servius Tullius, and cast his body down the steps of the Senate house. Unlike earlier kings, he did not seek the Senate's approval but ruled through fear. Tarquin abolished many of the rights of nobles, ruling with an iron hand. He relied on his household guard, bypassed the Senate, and judged according to his will. He launched ambitious building projects, including the completion of the great temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, but he forced citizens to labor without pay, turning public works into symbols of oppression. Foreign wars also marked his reign. He extended Roman power into Latium, but victories were overshadowed by cruelty and arrogance. Tarquin was remembered as proud, violent, and despotic, the embodiment of what Romans feared in monarchy. The outrage of Lucretia. The spark that lit rebellion came not from politics alone but from personal tragedy. Tarquin's son, Sextus Tarquinius, became infamous for his lust and arrogance. According to legend, Sextus visited the home of Lucius Tarquinius Collateralinius, a Roman noble, and his wife, Lucretia. Lucretia was celebrated for her virtue, modesty, and loyalty. While Collateralinius was away, Sextus entered her home at night and threatened her. He told her he would kill her and place her body beside that of a slave, destroying her honor. Faced with such a threat, Lucretia submitted. The next day, overwhelmed with shame, she summoned her husband and her father. In their presence, she told them what had happened. She demanded vengeance, declaring that though she had been violated, her spirit remained pure. Then, in an act that shocked her family and all Rome, Lucretia drew a dagger and took her own life. Her blood was the spark of revolution. Brutus and the Oath. At Lucretia's side that day was Lucius Junius Brutus, a cousin of Collateralinius. Brutus had long been regarded as slow-witted, a harmless man overlooked in politics. But in that moment, he revealed his true resolve. Raising the dagger still wet with Lucretia's blood, Brutus swore an oath, no Tarquin would ever rule Rome again. He called upon the Romans to expel the king and his family, to destroy the monarchy, and to create a new order. The nobles rallied to his cause. Outrage spread through the city, as citizens remembered Tarquin's tyranny and Sextus' crime. The Senate declared the monarchy abolished. Tarquin and his family were exiled. Brutus and Collateralinius were chosen as Rome's first consuls, magistrates who would share power in place of a king. Thus, in 509 BCE, the Roman Republic was born. The birth of the Republic. The Republic's first act was not to establish equality but to create limits. Romans had seen how monarchy could curdle into tyranny. They resolved never again to allow one man to hold absolute power. Instead, they built a system of checks and balances, distributing authority across offices. 2 consuls, elected annually, replaced the king. Each could veto the other. The Senate remained a council of elders, advising and guiding policy. The people's assemblies were given some say in elections and legislation, though dominated by the wealthy. This system was fragile, improvised, and often unjust, but it embodied a new principle, shared rule. Liberty, for Romans, did not mean freedom for all but freedom from kings. The struggle to defend the Republic. Tarquin the Proud did not accept exile quietly. From outside Rome, he sought allies among the Etruscans and attempted to regain his throne. In one early battle, Brutus himself faced Tarquin's forces. In combat, Brutus and Sextus Tarquinius killed one another, and both fell. The Republic was tested in its infancy, fighting to defend its new system. But Tarquin never returned. Rome, though besieged by enemies and torn by internal strife, held firm. Symbolism of the fall. To Romans, the expulsion of the kings was more than a historical event, it was a founding myth. Lucretia's tragedy became a symbol of virtue destroyed by tyranny, and Brutus' oath became the model of republican resolve. For centuries, Romans told this story to remind themselves why their republic existed, to prevent arrogance, to stop the rise of tyrants, to ensure liberty through law. the memory of Tarquin haunted them. Even when later generals grew powerful, Romans feared a new Tarquin. The very word rex, king, became hateful. For the rest of the Republic's history, no man would dare call himself king. Reflection. The fall of the kings was both tragedy and triumph, the tragedy of Lucretia, the triumph of the Republic. It shows how personal stories can spark political revolutions, how outrage can become resolve, how a city can redefine itself in a single moment. In 509 BCE, Rome swore never again to bow to a monarch. From that oath, a republic was born, one that would expand across Italy, fight Carthage and Greece, and eventually rule the known world. But the shadow of Tarquin would linger, a warning of what happens when one man holds too much power. Closing image. Picture Rome in 509 BCE. The streets are filled with shouts, citizens driving the Tarquins out, nobles gathering in the forum to swear oaths. The dagger of Lucretia glints in Brutus' hand, raised as a symbol of vengeance and liberty. Above, the Capitoline Hill stands tall, where a new temple rises, not to kings but to Jupiter, protector of the Republic. A new age has begun. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will explore the early years of the Republic, how power was organized among patrician families, how the Senate guided policy, and how Rome began its long struggle to balance order and liberty. When the kings were expelled in 509 BCE, the Romans celebrated their newfound freedom. But liberty, in those first years of the Republic, was not shared equally. Though the monarchy was gone, its power did not pass to all citizens. It was concentrated in the hands of a small group of aristocratic families, the patricians. For generations, these families dominated the Senate, the magistracies, and the law itself, shaping the Republic in their image. Tonight, we step into that early world of the Republic. We will see how the patricians held power, how the Senate became the central organ of government, and how the first institutions of republican rule developed. But we will also glimpse the tensions this created, tensions that would soon erupt in the great struggle between patricians and plebeians. The Republic was free of kings, but not yet free of inequality. Patricians and plebeians. At the heart of early Roman society lay a division between patricians and plebeians. The patricians were noble families who claimed descent from Rome's earliest senators, appointed by Romulus himself. Their status was hereditary, passed from father to son. They controlled the great estates, the priesthoods, and the highest political offices. The plebeians, by contrast, were the mass of ordinary Romans, farmers, artisans, soldiers, and laborers. They formed the backbone of the army and the workforce, but they had little political voice. In the early Republic, only patricians could hold the consulship, sit in the Senate, or interpret the law. This division was more than social, it was legal. The patricians had privileges written into custom and enforced by tradition. Plebeians were often subject to debt bondage, vulnerable to exploitation, and excluded from the corridors of power. The Senate. The central body of the new republic was the Senate, a council of elders. Senex in Latin means old men. Composed of about 300 members drawn from patrician families, the Senate advised magistrates, guided policy, and controlled finances. Though it had no formal lawmaking power in these early years, its prestige and authority were immense. The Senate embodied continuity. Where consuls came and went each year, the Senate endured, providing long-term stability. Over time, it would become the most powerful institution in the Republic, shaping Rome's destiny for centuries. The consuls. Replacing the king were two annually elected consuls. Each consul held the power of imperium, the authority to command armies and administer justice. But unlike a king, no consul could act alone. Each could veto the other, a system designed to prevent tyranny. Consuls wore the purple-bordered toga of office, sat in the ivory chair, and were accompanied by lictors carrying fasces, bundles of rods symbolizing authority. They were symbols of Rome's new liberty, but they were also patricians, elected by aristocratic influence, serving their class's interests. Other magistrates. Alongside consuls, other magistracies began to develop. Quaestors managed financial matters. Praetors emerged to handle judicial cases. Aediles oversaw markets and public works. Later, censors were introduced to oversee the census and moral conduct. All these offices were initially restricted to patricians. Each had limited terms, embodying the republican principle of rotation, but together they kept power within aristocratic hands. Religion and the patricians. Religion was inseparable from politics in early Rome, and the patricians controlled it. Only they could serve as pontiffs, augurs, or flamens, priests who interpreted the will of the gods. By monopolizing religion, patricians reinforced their political dominance, for no decision of war or peace could be made without divine sanction. For plebeians, this monopoly deepened their exclusion. Without access to priesthoods, they were cut off from one of the most powerful sources of authority in Roman life. The role of the army. Rome in the early Republic was a city always at war. Its neighbors in Latium, the Etruscans to the north, and Sabines and Volscians to the east and south all contested its power. Victory depended on citizen soldiers, primarily plebeians, who provided the manpower for the legions. Yet despite their sacrifices, plebeians had no share in decision-making. They marched, fought, and died for the Republic, but policies of war and peace were determined by patrician consuls and the Senate. This imbalance would soon fuel demands for reform. Debt and inequality. One of the gravest problems of the early Republic was debt bondage. Poor plebeians often borrowed from patricians in times of need. Unable to repay, they could be enslaved or forced into service. This created a cycle of dependency and resentment. Stories from this period tell of plebeian veterans returning from campaigns only to be thrown into prison for debt. Such injustices were not only personal but political. They convinced plebeians that freedom from kings had changed little, for they were still at the mercy of patrician power. Early conflicts. Within a few years of the Republic's founding, conflict erupted. In 494 BCE, plebeians, burdened by debt and excluded from power, staged a dramatic act of protest. They withdrew from the city altogether, seceding to a hill outside Rome. This first secession of the plebs threatened the city's survival, for without plebeians, Rome had no army. The patricians were forced to compromise. They agreed to create the office of the tribune of the plebs, a representative chosen by plebeians to defend their interests. Tribunes had the power to veto actions of consuls and protect citizens from unjust treatment. This was the first crack in patrician monopoly, and the beginning of a long struggle known as the conflict of the orders, which would shape the Republic for centuries. The patrician order. For now, however, patricians remained dominant. Their families formed a closed elite, intermarrying, controlling offices, and passing wealth down generations. Names like Claudius, Cornelius, Fabius, and Valerius became synonymous with power. They lived in houses on the Palatine Hill, adorned with ancestral masks, imagines, that proclaimed their lineage. Their voices carried in the Senate, their sons commanded legions, their clients filled the forum. To be patrician was not merely to be rich, it was to embody Rome's identity, to be guardian of tradition, to claim that one's ancestors had built the city itself. The plebeian future. Yet beneath this dominance, pressure was building. Plebeians demanded not only relief from debt but access to office, marriage rights with patricians, and written laws. Their struggle was long and often bitter, marked by secessions, protests, and occasional violence. But it was relentless. The Republic that began as an oligarchy would, over centuries, expand participation, imperfectly, unevenly, but decisively. From this struggle, Rome developed institutions that balanced aristocracy with popular voice, creating a system that fascinated even later thinkers like Cicero and, much later, America's founding fathers. Reflection. The early Republic was not yet the Rome we imagine. It was not yet a Mediterranean power, not yet a global empire. It was a city ruled by a narrow elite, struggling to define liberty in the shadow of monarchy. The patricians claimed guardianship of freedom, but plebeians soon discovered that freedom without rights was hollow. The tension between these classes would drive much of the Republic's internal history. It was not only wars abroad but struggles at home that shaped Rome. And in this contest, the Republic would become stronger, more flexible, and more complex than the kings it replaced. Closing image. Picture early Rome around 500 BCE. The forum bustles with citizens, but the senators, robed in purple-bordered togas, sit apart, their voices the only ones that matter. Consuls stride with lictors carrying fasces, symbols of authority. In the streets, plebeians grumble under debts, soldiers prepare for campaigns, farmers struggle with taxes. Above, the Palatine Hill gleams with aristocratic houses. Rome is free of kings, but not yet free of inequality. The seeds of future conflict are sown. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will follow the plebeians' challenge, the conflict of the orders, where common citizens fought for political rights, reshaping the Republic's institutions and its very meaning of liberty. The Roman Republic was born in 509 BCE with the expulsion of kings, but for most Romans, liberty remained incomplete. True, no single monarch ruled over them, but power was concentrated in the hands of the patrician elite, who filled the Senate, held the consulship, controlled the priesthoods, and interpreted the laws. For the plebeians, the majority of the population, life meant labor in fields, service in the legions, and burdens of debt, with little voice in how Rome was governed. Yet the plebeians were not powerless. They were the farmers who fed the city, the soldiers who fought its wars, the craftsmen who kept its markets alive. Without them, Rome could not survive. And in the early 5th century BCE, they began to recognize their collective strength. What followed was one of the most remarkable social struggles of the ancient world, the conflict of the orders, a centuries-long movement in which plebeians demanded rights, challenged inequality, and forced concessions from the patrician aristocracy. This is the story of that struggle, of how the Republic was reshaped not only by wars abroad but by battles within its own walls. The First Secession, 494 BCE. The earliest act of plebeian defiance came in 494 BCE. At that time, Rome faced war on multiple fronts, with neighboring tribes threatening the city. Plebeian soldiers, already burdened with debt and excluded from office, grew angry at being asked to fight and die for a state that gave them no rights. In protest, they withdrew from the city altogether. Marching out of Rome, they encamped on a nearby hill, the Sacred Mount, and refused to return until their grievances were addressed. This dramatic act, known as the First Secession of the Plebs, brought the city to crisis. Without plebeian soldiers, Rome had no army. Faced with disaster, the patricians compromised. They agreed to the creation of a new office, chosen by the plebeians themselves, the tribune of the plebs. The tribune of the plebs. The tribunes were unique in Roman government. They were elected by plebeians, independent of the Senate and patrician magistrates. Their primary role was to protect plebeians from injustice. Most importantly, tribunes had the power of veto, intercessio. By standing in person, a tribune could block the actions of a consul or senate decree. Any harm done to a tribune was considered a sacrilege, their bodies were sacrosanct. This gave plebeians, for the first time, an institutional weapon to defend their rights. It did not create equality overnight, but it marked the first breach in patrician monopoly. The 12 Tables, 451 to 450 BCE. The next great plebeian victory was the demand for written laws. In the early Republic, legal knowledge was monopolized by patricians, who alone knew the customs and procedures. Plebeians could be judged unfairly, with no access to precedent. In 451 BCE, after pressure and unrest, Rome appointed a special board of 10 men, the Decemviri, to draft a written code. The result was the 12 Tables, engraved on bronze tablets and displayed in the forum for all to see. The laws covered family, property, contracts, and crime. They were harsh by modern standards, debtors could be enslaved, thieves executed, but they represented a leap forward in transparency. No longer could patricians claim the law was secret knowledge. For the first time, plebeians had access to rules that applied to all citizens. The struggle for office. Despite these gains, plebeians were still excluded from high office. Only patricians could be consuls, praetors, or censors. For plebeians, this was intolerable. Why should they bear arms for Rome yet be denied leadership? The struggle intensified in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. Plebeians staged further secessions, withdrew from armies, and used their tribunes to block state business. Patricians resisted fiercely, claiming their bloodline gave them unique authority. But pressure mounted. At last, in 367 BCE, the Licinian Sextian laws broke the patrician monopoly. These reforms required that one of the two consuls each year could be a plebeian. Soon after, plebeians also gained access to the praetorship and censorship. The highest offices of Rome were no longer the preserve of aristocracy alone. Marriage rights. Another important reform came earlier, in 445 BCE. At that time, patricians and plebeians were forbidden to intermarry, a law that reinforced social separation. Plebeians protested, arguing that this denied them equality and honor. After years of debate, the law was repealed by the Canonian law, permitting intermarriage between classes. This was not only a social change but a political one. Over time, patrician and wealthy plebeian families intermarried, blending into a new ruling elite known as the nobiles. The growth of the assemblies. As plebeians gained rights, their political assemblies grew in importance. The Concilium Plebis, the Council of the Plebeians, passed resolutions known as plebiscites. At first, these applied only to plebeians, but by 287 BCE, with the Lex Hortensia, plebiscites became binding on all Romans. This was a turning point. It meant that the plebeian assembly had legislative authority equal to the Senate and patrician assemblies. The Republic was now a mixed system, patrician Senate, magistrates, and plebeian tribunes and assemblies, all sharing power in uneasy balance. Results of the conflict of the orders. By the early 3rd century BCE, the formal struggle had ended. Plebeians had gained. Tribunes with veto power. The right to intermarry with patricians. Access to high offices, including the consulship. Equal binding power of their assemblies. Greater transparency through written law. The Republic was now more inclusive, though still hierarchical. Wealthy plebeians joined patricians in a blended aristocracy, while poorer citizens continued to struggle. But the conflict had lasting effects. It gave Rome a political system that was unusually flexible, able to adapt through compromise. It also gave plebeians a permanent institutional voice, preventing absolute domination by any single class. Why it mattered. The conflict of the orders was more than a class struggle, it was the forging of the Republic's character. Rome became a state built on negotiation, compromise, and shared institutions. Its citizens learned that power could be contested without destroying the state, that rights could be won through persistence. This flexibility would help Rome endure crises that might have broken other states. When Hannibal invaded, when generals defied the Senate, when politics turned violent, the Republic could adapt. It was never perfect, but it was resilient. Reflection. The early Republic teaches us that freedom is not granted in a single moment. The overthrow of kings was only the beginning. For generations afterward, ordinary Romans had to fight for equality, using secessions, protests, and political maneuvering to secure their place. The Republic was built not only by patrician senators but by plebeian farmers who refused to be silenced. This long struggle gave Rome a depth of political life unmatched in the ancient world. It was a republic of orders, of classes, of conflict, but also of compromise. In that tension lay its strength. Closing image. Picture the Forum in the 4th century BCE. Tribunes stand before crowds of plebeians, voices echoing as they call for reform. Patrician senators scowl in their ivory chairs, resisting, yet wary of another secession. In the distance, consuls preside over legions preparing for war. The Republic is alive with argument, not unity, but out of that argument, it grows stronger. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will explore the creation of Rome's first written laws, the 12 Tables, and how they codified justice, preserved memory, and shaped Roman identity for centuries. In the early Republic, power belonged to the patrician elite. They sat in the Senate, wore the purple-bordered toga, held the consulship, and spoke with authority in religious matters. But perhaps their most potent weapon was their control of the law. Roman justice was rooted in custom and precedent, passed down orally, guarded as sacred knowledge by aristocratic priests and magistrates. For the plebeians, who lacked access to these unwritten rules, justice was uncertain, often tilted against them. A noble could interpret law to suit himself, while a plebeian had little recourse but to submit. This imbalance could not last. In the middle of the 5th century BCE, amid the ongoing conflict of the orders, plebeians demanded that Rome's laws be written down and made public. No longer would justice be a secret language controlled by patricians. The result was the 12 tables, engraved on bronze tablets and set up in the forum for all to see. Though harsh and primitive by modern standards, the 12 tables became the cornerstone of Roman law. They preserved not only rules of property and procedure but also the principle that law should be transparent, accessible, and binding on all citizens. Tonight, we walk through the story of the 12 tables, how they were created, what they contained, and why they mattered for the Republic's future. The demand for written law. By the 450s BCE, plebeians had secured tribunes to defend them and even forced some concessions on debt and office. Yet inequality remained. One of their greatest grievances was the uncertainty of law. Imagine a plebeian farmer summoned before a magistrate. He might be accused of debt, theft, or breach of contract. But the rules governing his case were not written anywhere. The patrician judge, often himself from the creditor class, could interpret custom however he wished. Plebeians argued that this was not liberty but disguised tyranny. The tribunes pressed for reform. They demanded a fixed, public code that all Romans could know and appeal to. Reluctantly, the patricians agreed, recognizing that compromise was necessary to prevent further unrest. The Decemvirs. In 451 BCE, Rome set aside its normal magistrates and appointed a special commission of 10 men, the Decemviri, to draft a code of laws. These men held extraordinary power. They governed Rome collectively, without consuls or tribunes, for 1 year. The Decemvirs studied Greek laws, drawing especially from the city of Athens, which had recently undergone similar codification under Solon. They also consulted Roman custom. After a year of work, they produced 10 tables of laws, which were displayed and approved by the people. But plebeians pressed for more. They wanted additional protections. So in 450 BCE, a second board of Decemvirs was appointed to add 2 more tables. Thus the 12 tables were completed. Abuse of power. The second Decemvirate, however, became notorious. One of its leaders, Appius Claudius, grew tyrannical. According to legend, he attempted to seize a young plebeian woman, Virginia, claiming she was a slave. To save her from dishonor, her father killed her in public, sparking outrage. The people rose in anger, deposing the Decemvirs and restoring the consulship and tribunate. But the 12 tables themselves survived, ratified as Rome's first written law code. The content of the 12 tables. The 12 tables covered a wide range of topics. Table 1 to 3, procedure and debt. Rules for trials, summons, and appeals. Debtors could be bound and even enslaved if they failed to pay, a harsh reality of early Rome. Table 4, family law. The authority of the paterfamilias, male head of household, was absolute. Fathers could sell their sons into slavery, though only a limited number of times. Table V, inheritance and guardianship. Outlined rights of heirs, guardianship of orphans, and property succession. Table 6 to 7, property and ownership. Defined contracts, transfers of land, and rights of neighbors. Clear boundaries and obligations prevented disputes. Table 8, crimes and punishments. Set penalties for theft, injury, and damage. Retaliation, lex talionis, an eye for an eye, was permitted in some cases, though fines could substitute. Table 9, public law. Declared that no one could be executed without trial, and banned laws targeting individuals. Table X, sacred law. Restricted excessive funerals and burial practices, emphasizing simplicity. Table 11 to 12, supplementary rules. Included the controversial ban on marriage between patricians and plebeians, later repealed, as well as additional clauses on debt and property. Harshness of the code. To modern eyes, the 12 tables seem severe. Debtors chained, children sold, thieves executed, it is a world far from ours. Yet for Romans, the value of the code was not in its leniency but in its certainty. For the first time, every citizen knew the rules. They might be harsh, but they were fixed, written, and public. Law was no longer the secret weapon of patricians but a shared framework for all. Symbolism of the 12 Tables. The 12 Tables became a symbol of Roman identity. Children memorized them in school, reciting their clauses as moral lessons. Orators quoted them centuries later, even when their provisions had been superseded. They were regarded not merely as law but as the foundation of justice itself. Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, declared, "The 12 Tables surpass in authority all the libraries of philosophers." For him, they embodied the Roman spirit of order and discipline. Long-term impact. Though many provisions were replaced by later statutes, the 12 Tables established key principles that shaped Roman law for centuries. Public accessibility of law. Justice must be written and visible. Equality of citizens under law. At least in theory, patricians and plebeians were subject to the same code. Fixed procedure. Trials followed rules, not whim. These principles became the backbone of Roman legal tradition, carried forward into the great codifications of the empire and influencing legal systems to this day. Reflection. The 12 Tables remind us that freedom is not only political but legal. Overthrowing kings did not guarantee justice if law remained hidden. By forcing Rome to engrave its rules in bronze, the plebeians transformed the republic. They made law a common possession, not a patrician privilege. In their harsh clauses, we glimpse an ancient world of debt bondage, patriarchy, and corporal punishment. But in their very existence, we see progress, the recognition that justice must be known, not concealed, and that equality begins with transparency. Closing image. Picture the Roman Forum in 450 BCE. Bronze tablets gleam in the sunlight, inscribed with clauses of law. Citizens gather to read, pointing, debating, reciting aloud. A farmer knows now the rule for debt. A craftsman sees the penalty for theft, a plebeian sees his rights inscribed. The Senate still rules, patricians still dominate, but the law is no longer secret. It belongs, at last, to Rome. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will follow Rome's wars for dominance in Latium, as the Republic secured its place among neighboring cities and tribes, fighting not only for survival, but for supremacy in Italy. By the mid-5th century BCE, the Roman Republic had survived its birth pangs. The kings were gone, the patricians had entrenched their authority, and the plebeians had begun their long struggle for rights. Inside the city, politics remained fraught, but outside the walls, another challenge loomed: Rome's survival among the many tribes and city-states of central Italy. The Italian peninsula was a patchwork of peoples. To the north, the Etruscans dominated, with their wealthy cities and elaborate culture. To the east and south lay the Sabines, Volsci, and Equi, warlike mountain peoples who raided Rome's fields. To the west stretched Latium, a fertile plain dotted with towns, Tusculum, Aricia, Lanuvium, and others. Rome itself was just one city among many, competing for land, trade, and prestige. In this part of our journey, we will trace Rome's early expansion in Latium, its wars against neighbors, its treaties and alliances, and its gradual rise from one city-state among many to the dominant power of the Latin plain. These conflicts were not only battles of soldiers but contests of endurance, diplomacy, and adaptation. The Latin League. Long before Rome's dominance, the Latin peoples had formed a loose confederation known as the Latin League. Bound by shared religion and mutual defense, they worshipped together at the sanctuary of Jupiter Laudieris on Mount Albanus. Rome, as one of the Latin cities, was part of this league. But as Rome grew, tensions increased. Who would lead the Latins in war? Who would control treaties with outsiders? Rome's ambitions strained the bonds of confederation. The early wars. From the late 6th through the 5th centuries BCE, Rome fought a series of wars with its neighbors. These wars were often small-scale raids and skirmishes, but they were relentless. The Volsci and Equi, fierce tribes from the Apennines, raided Roman territory repeatedly. Roman legions marched out year after year to defend fields and villages. The Sabines, long rivals of Rome since legendary times, continued to challenge Roman expansion. The Etruscans, especially the city of Veii to the north, posed a constant threat, competing for dominance of the Tiber Valley. These wars were less about conquest at first and more about survival. Rome fought to defend its land and maintain its status among equals. The Battle of Lake Regillus, c. 496 BCE. One of the most famous early battles was fought near Lake Regillus, against the combined forces of the Latin League. According to legend, the exiled King Tarquin the Proud, still seeking to regain his throne, allied with the Latins against Rome. The battle was fierce, with heavy casualties on both sides. Roman tradition claimed that the gods themselves intervened. Castor and Pollux, the twin horsemen of myth, appeared on the battlefield to fight for Rome. Whether myth or fact, Rome emerged victorious. The Foedus Cassianum, a treaty signed soon after, established peace between Rome and the Latin League. It provided for mutual defense and equal sharing of spoils, with Rome recognized as a leading partner. This was a turning point. Rome was no longer merely one Latin city, it was now the leader of the Latin peoples in war. Endless raids, Equi and Volsci. For much of the 5th century BCE, Rome was locked in near constant conflict with the Equi and Volsci. These tribes, dwelling in the Apennine hills, poured into Latium during harvest seasons, plundering crops and retreating to the mountains. Roman annals record campaign after campaign, consuls leading armies to push back raiders, building forts, besieging towns, and clashing in mountain passes. The wars were grueling, rarely decisive, but they hardened Roman soldiers and commanders. Out of this endless struggle, Rome developed its military system, annual levies of citizen soldiers, disciplined legions, and a culture of resilience. War became part of Roman life, an expectation for every citizen. The capture of Veii, 396 BCE. The greatest prize of early Roman expansion was the Etruscan city of Veii, just 12 miles north of Rome. Rich, powerful, and strategically placed, Veii had long contested control of the Tiber Valley. After decades of intermittent conflict, Rome launched a decisive siege in the early 4th century BCE. According to legend, the siege lasted 10 years, echoing the Greek tale of Troy. Finally, under the command of Marcus Furius Camillus, the Romans tunneled beneath the walls and stormed the city. The capture of Veii was momentous. Rome doubled its territory, gained access to rich resources, and destroyed a rival that had threatened it for generations. The spoils were immense, and many Roman citizens received land in the conquered territory. Rome was no longer a minor city, it was now a regional power. Integration of allies. Rome's genius lay not only in conquest but in integration. Unlike many states that ruled through domination, Rome offered defeated peoples a place in its system. Conquered towns might receive Roman citizenship, partial rights, or alliances binding them to provide troops. This policy created a web of loyalty and obligation. Instead of constant revolt, Rome found that many former enemies became reliable allies, supplying soldiers for future wars. This system would eventually extend across Italy, forming the foundation of Roman power. The Latin allies. The Latin League, once Rome's equal partner, gradually came under Roman dominance. After the capture of Veii, Rome's power far outstripped that of other Latin towns. Though treaties preserved the forms of alliance, in practice Rome led, and the Latins followed. Over time, Rome extended citizenship to some Latin communities, while others retained local autonomy under Roman leadership. This balance of inclusion and control allowed Rome to grow without overextending itself. The Gallic sack, 390 BCE. Rome's rise was not without setbacks. In 390 BCE, a Gallic tribe from the north, the Senans, invaded central Italy and defeated the Roman army at the Battle of the Allia. They marched into the city itself, burning much of Rome. This disaster was a shock to the Republic. Yet Rome recovered quickly. Rebuilding its walls stronger than before, Rome used the experience as motivation to tighten its military discipline and strengthen its alliances. The sack became a scar on Roman memory but also a lesson in resilience. Reflection. The expansion of Rome through Latium was not a single dramatic conquest but a long, grinding process: wars with neighbors, raids and counter-raids, treaties and betrayals. Yet through persistence, Rome emerged as the dominant power in central Italy. The capture of Veii showed Rome's capacity for decisive action. The integration of allies showed its political genius. Together, these qualities laid the groundwork for the next stage: Rome's struggle with the great Samnite tribes and, eventually, with the Greek world itself. Closing image. Picture Latium in the 4th century BCE. Roman legions march across the plain, standards glinting in the sun. Farmers return to fields newly secured from raiders. On the Capitoline Hill, senators debate treaties with neighboring towns. And beyond, the ruins of Veii stand as a warning: Rome's enemies may resist for years, but in the end, the Republic will prevail. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will see Rome turn its attention to a formidable foe, the Etruscans of the north. Their culture, wealth, and armies posed a challenge that tested Rome's strength and ambition. When we think of Rome's earliest centuries, we often picture a rising power, steady and inevitable in its march to greatness. But Rome was not always the giant it would become. In the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, the Republic lived in the shadow of the Etruscans, a people whose culture, wealth, and armies often eclipsed Rome's own. For generations, the Etruscan cities had dominated central Italy. Their kings had once ruled Rome itself. Their temples, art, and customs left an indelible imprint on Roman life. And for much of the early Republic, they remained both rivals and models, teaching Rome even as they resisted it. Tonight, we explore Rome's contests with the Etruscans, the wars that defined central Italy, the lessons Rome learned from its neighbors, and the eventual decline of Etruscan power. Who were the Etruscans? The Etruscans were a mysterious people, their language unlike any Indo-European tongue, their origins debated even in antiquity. Herodotus claimed they came from Asia Minor, others thought them native to Italy. What is clear is that by 700 BCE, the Etruscans had established a flourishing civilization in central Italy, in the region known as Etruria. Their cities, Veii, Tarquinii, Caera, Clusium, and many others, were rich and sophisticated. They built elaborate tombs decorated with vivid frescoes, crafted jewelry of exquisite detail, and engineered roads and drainage systems that impressed even the Romans. They traded widely, their ships sailing to Greece and beyond. For centuries, Etruscans held sway over Latium and Campania. Kings of Etruscan origin, like Tarquinius Priscus and Tarquinius Superbus, once ruled Rome itself. Even after the monarchy fell, Rome remained heavily influenced by Etruscan religion, architecture, and symbols of authority. The fasces, the lictors, the purple-bordered toga, all were Etruscan legacies. Rome and Veii. The city of Veii, just 12 miles north of Rome, was the Etruscans' most immediate rival. For centuries, the two cities clashed over territory along the Tiber, especially the fertile lands near Fidene. These wars were long and bitter. Roman armies marched year after year, sometimes victorious, often stalemated. The conflict culminated in the Great Siege of Veii, which lasted nearly a decade, ending in 396 BCE when the Roman general Marcus Furius Camillus captured and destroyed the city. The fall of Veii doubled Rome's territory, enriched its citizens with spoils, and marked the beginning of Rome's ascendancy. But it also showed the Republic's willingness to fight wars of attrition, to endure hardship until victory was achieved. The Battle of the Allia and the Gallic Sack. Rome's triumph over Veii was followed swiftly by disaster. In 390 BCE, a Gallic tribe, the Senans, swept into central Italy. Meeting the Romans at the river Allia, just north of Rome, the Gauls inflicted a crushing defeat. The surviving Romans fled, the Gauls marched into the city itself. For months, they occupied and plundered Rome, until finally withdrawing after a ransom was paid. This catastrophe shook Rome to its core. Much of the city lay in ashes, its prestige tarnished. The Etruscans seized the opportunity, pressing against Rome's weakened frontiers. Yet Rome rebuilt. Its citizens fortified their defenses, strengthened discipline, and learned a lesson that would echo through history. Rome could be defeated, but it would never remain defeated. Rome's resilience. The decades after the Gallic sack were years of struggle. Rome fought to reassert itself against the Etruscans, the Volsci, the Equi, and the Latins. Again and again, Roman armies marched into battle, often facing coalitions of enemies determined to keep Rome in check. But the Republic's resilience proved unmatched. Its citizen soldiers, bound by duty and discipline, returned each year to the field. Its leaders, though divided by class strife, rallied in the face of external threats. Gradually, Rome regained its footing. Clusium and the Etruscan decline. One of the great Etruscan cities was Clusium, modern Chiusi. In the early 4th century BCE, it sought Roman aid against Gallic incursions. This marked a shift. Once dominant, the Etruscans were now calling upon Rome for help. Over the following decades, Rome continued to expand at the expense of Etruscan cities. By forging alliances, exploiting rivalries, and pressing its military advantage, Rome steadily eroded Etruscan independence. The decline of Etruscan power was not solely due to Rome. Greek colonies in southern Italy, Celtic invasions from the north, and internal divisions all weakened them. But Rome was the beneficiary, absorbing Etruscan lands and adapting their culture. Lessons from the Etruscans. While Rome conquered the Etruscans, it also absorbed much from them. Religion, Roman augury, haruspices, diviners, and many priestly rituals were Etruscan in origin. Symbols of power, the fasces, the curule chair, the triumphal procession, all derived from Etruscan practice. Engineering, drainage, road building, and stone construction were influenced by Etruscan expertise. Urban life, temples, forums, and city planning reflected Etruscan models. Rome's genius was not only in conquest but in assimilation. The Republic took what was useful, adapted it, and made it Roman. A new power balance. By the early 3rd century BCE, Etruscan power was fading. Rome controlled much of Latium, had subdued Veii, and was pressing northward. Other Etruscan cities remained independent, but their influence waned. Rome was now poised to face even greater challenges, the mighty Samnite tribes of the Apennines, and beyond them, the Greek cities of southern Italy. Reflection. The wars with the Etruscans remind us that Rome's rise was neither smooth nor inevitable. For generations, Rome was a vulnerable city-state, surrounded by rivals who were richer, older, and more cultured. It was Rome's resilience, its refusal to accept defeat, and its willingness to borrow from others that allowed it to endure. The Republic learned from the Etruscans not only how to fight, but how to rule. From them, Rome gained symbols that would define its authority for centuries. And in defeating them, Rome proved it was ready to move beyond Latium and Etruria, toward mastery of all Italy. Closing image. Picture Rome in the aftermath of Veii's fall. Smoke rises from the conquered city, its treasures carried south to Rome. Farmers settle on new lands, soldiers return with spoils. In the forum, senators debate how to defend against new threats, while augurs consult the will of the gods. Rome has triumphed over its rival, but greater trials lie ahead. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will follow Rome into the Samnite Wars, a series of brutal conflicts in the Apennine Mountains that tested the Republic's military and reshaped Italy's balance of power. By the mid-4th century BCE, Rome had emerged as the dominant power in Latium. It had subdued Veii, fended off the Volsci and Equi, and reasserted its influence over the Latin League. But its ambitions, and its survival, demanded more. To secure its place in Italy, Rome had to confront one of the most formidable peoples of the peninsula, the Samnites. The Samnites were no ordinary rival. Fierce, resilient, and masters of mountain warfare, they lived in the rugged Apennine highlands of south-central Italy. They were not a single state but a confederation of tribes, united by language and culture. Proud of their independence, they resisted domination by any outside power. And when Rome's expansion brought it into contact with them, the result was nearly a century of conflict known as the Samnite Wars. These wars, fought in 3 distinct phases between 343 and 290 BCE, would transform Rome. They forced the Republic to adapt its military, refine its alliances, and extend its influence across Italy. They were costly and brutal, but out of them, Rome emerged as the unrivaled master of the Italian peninsula. The Samnites, people of the mountains. The Samnites were Oscan-speaking tribes who inhabited the mountainous regions of Campania, Samnium, and Apulia. Hardy farmers and warriors, they lived in scattered hill forts rather than great cities. Their society prized freedom and martial skill, producing fighters who excelled in ambushes, raids, and rugged terrain. To their neighbors, the Samnites were both feared and admired. Greek writers described them as brave but fierce, stubbornly resisting domination. For Rome, they were both a challenge and an opportunity. To defeat them would open vast new lands and secure dominance in central Italy. The First Samnite War, 343 to 341 BCE. The conflict began not with direct rivalry, but with the Greek city of Capua in Campania. Capua, wealthy and fertile, was threatened by Samnite incursions. Desperate, it appealed to Rome for aid. Rome agreed, partly out of opportunism, partly out of fear that the Samnites might expand too far. The Senate declared war, and Roman armies marched south into Campania. The war was brief but intense. Roman sources describe several battles in which Roman consuls triumphed, including a hard-fought clash in the mountain passes. In the end, however, peace was negotiated. Rome recognized Samnite independence in return for influence in Campania. The outcome was inconclusive, but the seeds of rivalry had been planted. The Latin War, 340 to 338 BCE. Before the next Samnite conflict could erupt, Rome faced a rebellion closer to home. The Latin League, long resentful of Roman dominance, rose in revolt, joined by some Campanian allies. The war was fierce, but Rome prevailed. In its aftermath, Rome dissolved the Latin League. Some Latin towns were granted Roman citizenship, others became allies bound by treaty. This was a turning point. Rome no longer tolerated equal partners. From now on, its allies were subordinated within a Roman-led system. The settlement of the Latin War strengthened Rome for the greater challenge that lay ahead, the Second Samnite War. The Second Samnite War, 326 to 304 BCE. This was the longest and most decisive of the Samnite conflicts, lasting more than 20 years. It began over control of Neapolis, modern Naples, a Greek city coveted by both Samnites and Romans. Rome intervened, seizing the city and provoking Samnite hostility. At first, Rome advanced confidently, campaigning deep into Samnite territory. But in 321 BCE, disaster struck. The Caudine Forks, 321 BCE. Roman consuls led their legions into a mountain pass near Caudium, only to find it blocked at both ends by Samnite forces. Trapped with no escape, the Romans were forced to surrender without a fight. The humiliation was complete. The Samnite general Pontius compelled the Roman soldiers to pass under a yoke, 2 spears fixed upright with a third laid across, symbolizing subjugation. For Romans, obsessed with honor, it was a wound deeper than defeat. The Senate refused to ratify the peace, arguing that the consuls had surrendered dishonorably. War resumed, with vengeance as its fuel. Recovery and resilience. Rome's resilience shone in the aftermath. Rather than collapse, the Republic rebuilt its armies, fortified its positions, and adapted its strategy. No longer relying on set battles in difficult terrain, the Romans built roads and colonies to secure territory, projecting power steadily into Samnite lands. Over the next decade, the tide turned. Rome won key victories at Lake Vadimo and elsewhere, gradually wearing down Samnite resistance. By 304 BCE, the Samnites sued for peace. The Third Samnite War, 298 to 290 BCE. The final and fiercest phase began when Samnites, seeking allies, joined forces with Etruscans, Umbrians, and Gauls. It was a grand coalition, meant to crush Rome once and for all. The stakes were enormous. A Roman defeat could have ended its rise entirely. Victory would secure its dominance in Italy. The Battle of Sentinum, 295 BCE. The The decisive clash came at Sentinum in 295 BCE. The coalition forces were vast, including Gallic chariots, Etruscan infantry, and Samnite warriors. The Romans, led by consuls Quintus Fabius Maximus and Publius Decius Mus, faced annihilation. In the heat of battle, Decius Mus performed the ultimate act of Roman devotion, the devotio. Calling upon the gods, he charged into the enemy lines, sacrificing his life to secure victory for Rome. Inspired, the Romans rallied. By day's end, the coalition was shattered. The victory at Sentinum broke the back of Samnite resistance. Over the next few years, Rome campaigned ruthlessly, defeating remaining forces. In 290 BCE, the Samnites finally submitted, ending nearly a century of conflict. Consequences of the Samnite Wars. The Samnite Wars were transformative. Their consequences rippled through every part of Roman life. Military evolution. Rome refined the manipular legion, a flexible formation better suited to rough terrain than the rigid phalanx. This adaptation became the foundation of Roman military dominance. Expansion of power. Rome now controlled much of central and southern Italy, from Etruria to Campania to Samnium. Alliance system. Rome perfected its system of treaties, binding defeated peoples as allies required to provide troops but not equal rights. This expanded Rome's military manpower enormously. Prestige and identity. Victory over such fierce enemies solidified Rome's self-image as destined to rule. The humiliation at the Caudine Forks was avenged, replaced by triumph at Sentinum. Reflection. The Samnite Wars were among the hardest struggles Rome ever faced. Unlike later wars of conquest, these were contests of survival and resilience, fought against enemies as disciplined and determined as Rome itself. Victory was not inevitable, it was earned through adaptation, sacrifice, and relentless endurance. Rome emerged transformed, no longer a regional power of Latium, but the leading force of Italy. Yet this very success would draw it into new conflicts, with the Greek cities of the south, with the kingdom of Epirus, and eventually with Carthage itself. Closing image. Picture the field of Sentinum after the battle. Fallen warriors lie scattered, Samnites, Gauls, Etruscans, Romans alike. The body of Decius Mus rests where he fell, honored by comrades. Roman standards rise above the smoke, their eagles gleaming in the sun. The Republic has endured, triumphed, and taken another step toward empire. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will examine Rome's system of alliances and integration, how it bound conquered peoples into its orbit, creating a uniquely durable network that expanded Rome's strength far beyond its own citizen body. When we think of empire, we often imagine conquest, armies storming cities, lands annexed, peoples subdued. But Rome's rise in Italy was built on something subtler, something more enduring than mere force. It was built on alliances. From the 5th through the 3rd centuries BCE, as Rome expanded from a city-state to the master of central Italy, it developed a system unlike that of its rivals. Where others demanded tribute and submission, Rome offered partnership, unequal partnership, to be sure, but one that bound allies into its orbit rather than leaving them perpetually rebellious. The result was a web of obligations and loyalties that multiplied Rome's strength many times over. Tonight, we will explore this system of integration, how Rome structured its alliances, what it offered, what it withheld, and why it worked so effectively. We will see how defeated peoples were not simply crushed but woven into the fabric of the Republic, sometimes as citizens, sometimes as allies, but always as participants in Rome's destiny. The challenge of governing conquest. After the Samnite Wars, Rome controlled vast swathes of central and southern Italy. But how could a single city-state govern such territory? Other powers had tried. The Etruscans built loose leagues of cities, the Greeks established colonies bound by trade, the Samnites ruled confederations of tribes. Yet all struggled to maintain unity. Rivalries tore them apart, rebellions weakened them, and invaders exploited them. Rome needed a system that would endure. It could not garrison every conquered city with Roman troops. It could not simply enslave or depopulate entire regions. Instead, it crafted a model of shared security and layered citizenship, a model both flexible and firm. Roman citizenship. At the heart of this system lay citizenship. Roman citizenship was a prized status, granting rights in law, the ability to vote in assemblies, protection from arbitrary punishment, and, for those of property, the right to serve in the legions. But Rome did not give this status equally. Instead, it created grades of citizenship. Full citizenship, civitas optimo iure, the citizens of Rome itself, with full rights of vote, office, and marriage. Partial citizenship, civitas sine suffragio, communities granted Roman legal rights but not the right to vote in Roman assemblies. These people could serve in the army, marry Romans, and appeal to Roman courts, but had no political voice in Rome. Allies, socii, independent communities bound by treaty to Rome. They retained self-government but pledged to provide troops when called upon. This hierarchy ensured loyalty while maintaining Roman dominance. Colonies. Another key feature of Rome's system was the establishment of colonies. After victories, Rome often planted colonies of Roman or Latin citizens in strategic locations, fortresses of Roman presence amid newly conquered lands. These colonies served three purposes. They secured borders and kept watch on restless neighbors. They rewarded veterans and citizens with land, tying them personally to Rome's expansion. They spread Roman culture and institutions, weaving conquered lands into the Republic's orbit. Colonies were not large, but their presence was powerful, a reminder that Rome was never far away. Military obligations. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Rome's alliances was military. Defeated peoples did not pay tribute in coin, as in other empires. Instead, they paid in men. Each allied community was required to provide troops proportionate to its population. These soldiers served alongside Roman legions, commanded by Roman consuls, but retained their local identity. The combined force was called the socii army. This system multiplied Rome's manpower enormously. By the 3rd century BCE, in a major war, Rome could field armies many times larger than its own citizen body. It was this reservoir of allied manpower that allowed Rome to endure disasters like Cannae during the Punic Wars. Where other states would have collapsed after a single defeat, Rome could call upon allies again and again. The balance of carrot and stick. Rome's genius lay in balancing generosity and control. Allies were not crushed, their autonomy was often respected. They kept their local magistrates, councils, and traditions. In many cases, they prospered under Rome, enjoying peace and protection. But they were also carefully managed. They could not make treaties without Rome's approval. Their soldiers fought under Roman command. Colonies and roads tied them into the Roman system. Rebellion was punished harshly, but loyalty was rewarded with protection and, sometimes, the gift of citizenship. The result was a system both inclusive and hierarchical, a federation in which Rome was always first among unequals. Case studies. Tusculum, after rebelling in 381 BCE, the city was granted full Roman citizenship. Its citizens became Romans, voting in assemblies and serving as magistrates. This showed that rebellion could end not in destruction, but in incorporation. Capua, after appealing to Rome during the Samnite Wars, Capua became an ally. Though wealthy and proud, it accepted Roman oversight in return for security. Latins, after the Latin War, many Latin communities were dissolved or absorbed. Some gained partial citizenship, others became allies. The result was fragmentation, preventing any united rebellion. Roads and integration. Another key to Roman control was infrastructure. Beginning in the 4th century BCE, Rome built roads that radiated from the city like spokes of a wheel. The most famous, the Via Appia, stretched southward toward Capua and later to Brundisium. These roads served military and economic purposes alike. They allowed armies to march swiftly, supplies to move reliably, and communication to flow. For allies, they symbolized connection, but also surveillance. Rome could appear at any moment. Why the system worked. Several factors explain why Rome's system endured. Flexibility, different statuses allowed Rome to tailor arrangements for each community. Incentives, citizenship, with its legal protections and prestige, was a prize that encouraged loyalty. Shared burden, military obligations tied allies to Rome's successes and failures alike. Divide and rule, by fragmenting opposition and rewarding loyalty selectively, Rome prevented large coalitions from forming. Resilience, unlike tribute-based systems, Rome's model built deep reserves of manpower, sustaining it through long wars. Long-term consequences. By 300 BCE, Rome's web of alliances extended across most of central Italy. This was the Republic's hidden strength. While other states rose and fell, Rome could draw upon a vast pool of allies. But this system also sowed seeds of future conflict. Allies contributed men but had no share in Roman politics. For centuries, this imbalance persisted, until, in the social war of the 1st century BCE, Italy's allies finally demanded equal rights. Still, in Rome's rise to Mediterranean dominance, the alliance system was indispensable. Without it, Rome could never have withstood Hannibal, conquered Greece, or faced Carthage across the seas. Reflection. Rome's story reminds us that empire is not built by force alone. Roads, laws, alliances, and citizenship mattered as much as swords and shields. The Republic's genius was not only in winning battles but in keeping peace afterward, weaving defeated peoples into its fabric. Through this system, Rome transformed enemies into allies, allies into partners, and partners into Romans. This capacity to integrate was one of its greatest strengths, a strength that made its rise unstoppable. Closing image. Picture Italy around 300 BCE. From the Alps to the southern coasts, towns and tribes are tied into Rome's orbit. Colonies gleam on strategic hills, Roman roads cut through valleys, allied soldiers march beside Roman legions. No single city commands all, yet all roads lead to Rome. The Republic is no longer just a city, it is a network, a system, a destiny in the making. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will witness Rome's clash with the Greek world in Italy, as the Republic confronts King Pyrrhus of Epirus in the dramatic Pyrrhic War, a struggle that tested Rome against the armies of the Hellenistic age. By the dawn of the 3rd century BCE, Rome had achieved what once seemed impossible. From a single city on the Tiber, it had become the master of central Italy. The Latin League was dissolved, the Samnites subdued, the Etruscans diminished. Roman colonies dotted the peninsula, roads tied it together, and alliances gave the Republic a vast reservoir of manpower. But in southern Italy, another world awaited. Here, along the coasts of Campania, Calabria, and Apulia, Greek colonies flourished. Known collectively as Magna Graecia, these cities, Tarentum, Croton, Locri, Rhegium, and others, were heirs to the culture of classical Greece. They built theaters and temples, traded across the seas, and brought with them the art, philosophy, and politics of the Hellenic world. Rome and Greece were destined to collide. And when they did, it would be in a war remembered less for decisive victories than for the figure at its center, Pyrrhus of Epirus, a king whose brilliance nearly halted Rome's rise, but whose very successes gave birth to a phrase still used today, a Pyrrhic victory. The spark of conflict. The trouble began in 282 BCE. The Greek city of Tarentum, wealthy and proud, dominated southern Italy. Long suspicious of Roman expansion, it viewed Rome's growing presence in the region as a threat. When a Roman fleet entered the Gulf of Tarentum, allegedly violating a treaty that forbade Roman ships from sailing there, Tarentines attacked, sinking several vessels. Rome responded with embassies, demanding redress. The Tarentines mocked them, even insulting the envoys. Rome declared war. Tarentum, realizing it could not face Rome alone, turned to the wider Greek world for aid. It found its champion in Pyrrhus, king of Epirus. Pyrrhus of Epirus. Pyrrhus was no ordinary king. A cousin of Alexander the Great, he had grown up in the turbulent world of Hellenistic monarchies. Ambitious, restless, and brilliant in battle, he dreamed of carving out his own empire. Italy, with its fertile lands and strategic position, offered the perfect opportunity. When Tarentum appealed for help, Pyrrhus saw more than a defensive alliance. He saw a chance to extend his power westward, to unite the Greek cities of Italy and Sicily under his rule, and to challenge Rome itself. The invasion of Italy, 280 BCE. In 280 BCE, Pyrrhus landed in Italy with a formidable army. It was not vast, around 25,000 men, but it was professional, disciplined, and unlike anything Rome had faced. His force included phalanxes of heavy infantry, armed with long spears, sarissas; cavalry, skilled in shock charges; light troops with javelins and slings; and, most striking of all, war elephants, creatures Rome had never encountered, whose size and ferocity terrified both men and horses. For Rome, used to fighting Samnite warriors in mountain passes, this was a new kind of war. The Battle of Heraclea, 280 BCE. The first great clash came near Heraclea on the Siris River. Roman consuls led legions south, confident in their numbers. Pyrrhus, eager to test his army, deployed his phalanx in deep ranks, with elephants held in reserve. The battle raged fiercely. Roman maniples, flexible and disciplined, fought hard against the wall of spears. At times, they broke through, threatening Pyrrhus' center. But then he unleashed his elephants. The massive beasts charged, trumpeting and trampling, scattering Roman cavalry and breaking their lines. The Romans retreated, suffering heavy losses, perhaps 15,000 men. Pyrrhus had won, but at a cost of thousands of his own. Still, the Greek world celebrated. Here was a king who had checked Rome. Aftermath and diplomacy. Following Heraclea, Pyrrhus sought to negotiate. He sent his advisor, the statesman Cineas, to Rome with generous terms, peace in exchange for Roman withdrawal from southern Italy. In the Senate, debate raged. Some favored compromise. But the elder statesman Appius Claudius Caecus, though old and blind, was carried into the chamber to speak. He urged defiance, declaring that Rome must never bow to a foreign king. Inspired, the Senate rejected Pyrrhus' offer. Rome would fight on. The Battle of Asculum, 279 BCE. The next year, the armies met again at Asculum. Once more, the battle was hard fought. Once more, Pyrrhus deployed his elephants to deadly effect. And once more, the Romans were forced to retreat. But Pyrrhus' losses were severe. His army, far from home, could not replenish men easily, while Rome could draw upon its vast network of allies. When congratulated on his victory, Pyrrhus famously remarked, "Another such victory, and I am undone." Thus was born the phrase Pyrrhic victory, a triumph so costly it is indistinguishable from defeat. Sicily and Carthage. Seeking to strengthen his position, Pyrrhus turned his attention to Sicily in 278 BCE. The Greek cities there, threatened by Carthage, invited him as a liberator. Pyrrhus crossed the strait, driving Carthaginians from much of the island. For a time, he was hailed as a new Alexander. But his ambition alienated allies. He demanded ships, men, and money, ruling with heavy hand. Soon, Sicilians grew weary of him. Meanwhile, Rome remained undefeated in Italy, and Carthage, though checked in Sicily, was still a power to be reckoned with. Pyrrhus had stretched himself too thin. The Battle of Beneventum, 275 BCE. In 275 BCE, Pyrrhus returned to Italy for one final campaign. At Beneventum, his army clashed with the Romans once more. This time, Roman discipline and growing familiarity with elephants turned the tide. The battle ended inconclusively, but strategically it was a Roman success. Exhausted, Pyrrhus withdrew. He returned to Epirus, leaving his Italian adventure unfinished. A few years later, he would die in battle in Greece, struck down in a street fight. Consequences of the Pyrrhic War. The war ended without a formal treaty, but its results were clear. Rome triumphant. Though beaten in individual battles, Rome had outlasted Pyrrhus. Its resilience and manpower proved decisive. Greek cities subdued, without Pyrrhus' protection, Tarentum and other cities submitted to Rome. Magna Graecia was absorbed into the Republic's sphere. Prestige enhanced, Rome had faced a Hellenistic king, trained in the tradition of Alexander, and survived. Its reputation soared. Carthage's rivalry, Pyrrhus' campaigns in Sicily foreshadowed the coming clash between Rome and Carthage, the Punic Wars. Reflection. The Pyrrhic War was a test not just of arms but of endurance. Pyrrhus was, in many ways, the superior general. His phalanx, cavalry, and elephants overwhelmed the Romans in battle after battle. But Rome had what he did not: inexhaustible allies, iron discipline, and a refusal to quit. In the end, Rome did not need a single great victory. It needed only to endure until Pyrrhus could endure no longer. That endurance became the hallmark of Roman power, a quality that would carry it through Hannibal's invasion, through civil wars, and through centuries of conflict. Closing image. Picture Pyrrhus departing Italy, his ships heavy with weary soldiers and wounded elephants. Behind him, Tarentum lies vulnerable, Sicilian allies bitter, his dreams of empire fading. In Rome, senators stand tall, proud that they defied a king and emerged stronger. The Republic has faced the might of Greece and proven itself unbreakable. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will turn to the First Punic War, Rome's first clash with Carthage, the great naval power of the Western Mediterranean, in a struggle that would transform the Republic into a seafaring empire. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome had secured dominance over the Italian peninsula. From the Alps in the north to the heel of Calabria in the south, Rome's allies, colonies, and citizens stretched across the land. The Republic had survived wars with the Etruscans, the Samnites, and even Pyrrhus of Epirus. Yet beyond Italy lay new horizons, and new rivals. To the west, across the narrow waters separating Sicily from the mainland, stood Carthage, the greatest naval power of the Western Mediterranean. Founded centuries earlier by Phoenician traders, Carthage had grown into a commercial empire, its fleets patrolling sea routes from North Africa to Spain, Sardinia, and Sicily. Its harbors bustled with trade, its coffers swelled with wealth, and its armies, composed largely of mercenaries, were feared across the seas. It was inevitable that Rome and Carthage would collide. Their rivalry began not as a deliberate war of conquest, but as a local dispute in Sicily. Yet it grew into a conflict lasting more than 2 decades, fought on land and sea, ending with Rome's emergence as a naval power and Carthage humbled. This was the First Punic War, the beginning of a struggle that would span a century and define the destiny of the Mediterranean. The spark in Sicily. Sicily was the jewel of the central Mediterranean, fertile, wealthy, and strategically placed. Greek cities like Syracuse flourished on its coasts, while Carthaginian colonies dominated its western half. In 264 BCE, a small town called Messana, at the strait between Sicily and Italy, became the flashpoint. Mercenaries known as the Mamertines seized the town and sought allies. Some appealed to Carthage, others to Rome. The Romans debated. Intervention meant entering Sicilian affairs and provoking Carthage. Yet the strategic value of Messana was too great to ignore. In the end, Rome sent forces, clashing with Carthaginian garrisons. The First Punic War had begun. Carthage, mistress of the seas. At the war's outset, Carthage seemed invincible. Its navy was the largest in the Mediterranean, with hundreds of sleek, fast warships called quinqueremes. Crewed by skilled sailors from Phoenician and allied cities, these ships could ram enemies with bronze prows, board them with marines, and maneuver with deadly precision. Rome, by contrast, had almost no naval tradition. Its strength was on land, in the discipline of its legions. To face Carthage, Rome would need to create a navy from nothing. Rome builds a fleet. According to tradition, the Romans captured a wrecked Carthaginian quinquereme and used it as a model. Within months, Roman shipyards produced an entire fleet. But Rome knew its sailors could not match Carthaginian skill in maneuver. So the Romans turned naval combat into something more like land battle. They invented the corvus, a boarding device consisting of a long gangplank with a spike at the end. When a Roman ship closed with an enemy, the corvus dropped, hooking onto the deck. Legionaries swarmed across, turning sea battles into infantry clashes, where Romans excelled. Early battles. In 260 BCE, the Romans won their first great naval victory at Mylae, using the corvus to capture dozens of Carthaginian ships. It was a stunning upset, the landlocked republic had beaten the greatest seafaring power of the age. Over the next decade, Rome and Carthage clashed across Sicily and the surrounding seas. Battles raged at Agrigentum, Ecnomus, and other sites. Rome often triumphed, but its fleets also suffered disasters, not only in combat but in storms. Hundreds of ships wrecked, tens of thousands of men drowned. Still, Rome persisted, rebuilding again and again. Its resilience was unmatched. The invasion of Africa. In 256 BCE, Rome attempted to end the war decisively by striking Carthage itself. A massive fleet transported legions across the sea, landing in North Africa. At first, the campaign succeeded. Roman forces won victories, ravaging Carthaginian lands. But soon fortune turned. Carthage hired a Spartan general, Xanthippus, who trained its armies in disciplined phalanx tactics. At the Battle of Tunis, Carthaginian cavalry and elephants crushed the Romans, capturing or killing thousands. The invasion failed. Rome withdrew, but the war dragged on. Stalemate in Sicily. For years, the struggle centered on Sicily. Roman and Carthaginian armies besieged towns, raided countrysides, and clashed in countless skirmishes. Neither side could gain decisive control. Carthage relied on its navy to resupply garrisons, while Rome used its allies to field endless armies. The island became a graveyard for soldiers, its fields trampled, its cities devastated. The final push. By the 240s BCE, both sides were exhausted. Rome had lost fleets in storms, Carthage faced financial strain from hiring mercenaries. Yet neither would yield. In 241 BCE, Rome raised one last fleet, financed not by the state but by wealthy citizens contributing privately. At the Battle of the Aegates Islands, the Romans scored a decisive victory, sinking or capturing much of the Carthaginian fleet. Carthage, unable to continue, sued for peace. The Treaty of Lutetius, 241 BCE. The war ended with harsh terms for Carthage. Carthage surrendered Sicily to Rome. It paid a massive indemnity over 10 years. Rome emerged as the dominant power in the central Mediterranean. For the first time, Rome had gained territory beyond Italy. Sicily became its first province, administered by a Roman governor. Consequences of the First Punic War. The war had profound consequences. Rome becomes a naval power. From nothing, Rome built a fleet that rivaled Carthage's. The Republic was now both land and sea power. Carthage weakened, financially drained and territorially diminished. Carthage entered a period of internal strife. Expansion of empire. Sicily's annexation marked the beginning of Rome's overseas empire. Foreshadowing, the rivalry was not over. Both powers knew the struggle would resume. The First Punic War was only the opening act. Reflection. The First Punic War was a trial of endurance, lasting nearly 25 years. It showed Rome's extraordinary resilience. After storms sank fleets, after invasions failed, after defeats on land and sea, the Republic rebuilt and returned. Where others might have surrendered, Rome persisted until victory was achieved. It also revealed the Republic's genius for adaptation, turning sea battles into land battles with the corvus, learning shipbuilding from enemies, financing fleets through citizen contributions. Again and again, Rome transformed adversity into opportunity. Closing image. Picture the aftermath in Sicily. Carthaginian garrisons march out of cities they once controlled, their banners lowered. Roman governors arrive, establishing order. In the Forum at Rome, senators proclaim victory, while citizens marvel that their city now rules an island across the sea. The Republic has crossed a threshold. It is no longer just the master of Italy, but of provinces abroad. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will turn to the Second Punic War, and to Carthage's revenge under Hannibal, Rome's greatest trial, and one of the most dramatic sagas in all history. The First Punic War had ended in 241 BCE with Rome victorious, Carthage humbled, and Sicily annexed as Rome's first province. Yet the rivalry was far from over. Carthage, though wounded, remained rich and powerful, its fleet still formidable, its ambitions unbroken. Rome, triumphant but wary, knew that a reckoning would come. The peace was uneasy, the resentment deep. That reckoning arrived in 218 BCE, with the outbreak of the Second Punic War, a conflict so dramatic, so filled with triumphs and disasters, that it would shape the fate of the Republic for generations. At its heart stood one man, Hannibal Barca, a general of extraordinary genius, whose boldness and audacity nearly brought Rome to its knees. Tonight, we follow Hannibal's opening gambit, his march from Spain, across the Alps, and into Italy, a feat so daring that it became legend. Carthage after the First Punic War. The loss of Sicily had shaken Carthage deeply. Its treasury was drained by war indemnities, its citizens burdened by debt, its prestige diminished. Worse, soon after the war, Carthage faced a brutal rebellion of its own mercenaries, known as the Truceless War. For years, Carthaginian generals fought to suppress the revolt, which ravaged North Africa and nearly destroyed the city. Yet out of this turmoil, a new base of strength emerged, Spain. Carthaginian leaders, seeking wealth and soldiers, expanded into the Iberian Peninsula. Rich in silver mines and fierce tribal warriors, Spain became a new frontier for Carthaginian power. Hamilcar Barca and his legacy. The man most responsible for this expansion was Hamilcar Barca, a brilliant general and father of Hannibal. Hamilcar commanded in the final years of the First Punic War and then led campaigns in Spain. There, he forged a power base independent of Carthage's oligarchs, securing loyalty from Iberian tribes and gathering resources. According to legend, before departing Carthage for Spain, Hamilcar brought his young son Hannibal to the altar and made him swear eternal hatred of Rome. Whether fact or myth, it captures the spirit that drove the Barcid family, a burning desire for revenge. Hannibal takes command. After Hamilcar's death, his son-in-law Hasdrubal continued Carthaginian expansion in Spain, founding the city of Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena. When Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 BCE, command passed to Hannibal, then only in his mid-20s. From the start, Hannibal displayed the qualities that would define him: charisma, courage, and audacity. He quickly won the loyalty of Iberian tribes, strengthened Carthaginian control, and prepared for confrontation with Rome. The spark of war. The immediate cause of conflict was the city of Saguntum, a Roman ally in eastern Spain. In 219 BCE, Hannibal besieged and captured it, defying Roman warnings. Rome demanded his surrender. Carthage refused. The Senate in Rome declared war. Hannibal, however, would not wait for Rome to bring the fight to Spain or Africa. He envisioned something bolder, an invasion of Italy itself. He would strike at Rome's heart, rally its allies to revolt, and break the Republic's power forever. The march to the Alps. In the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal set out from Spain with an army of around 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. He crossed the Ebro River, subdued hostile tribes, and marched toward Gaul. The journey was grueling. Many Iberian troops deserted, unwilling to leave their homeland. Hannibal pressed on, forging alliances with Gallic tribes, fighting others. By the time he reached the foothills of the Alps, his army was already diminished. The crossing of the Alps. The Alps were a natural barrier, towering and treacherous. No army had attempted such a crossing on this scale. Winter was approaching, snow and ice covered the passes. Yet Hannibal pressed forward. Roman sources, hostile but admiring, described the ordeal in vivid detail. Narrow paths where men and animals slipped to their deaths. Rockslides triggered by enemy tribes hurling stones. Elephants struggling on icy slopes. Soldiers hacking paths through snow, lowering animals by ropes across cliffs. The suffering was immense. Of the tens of thousands who set out, perhaps half perished. Yet against all odds, Hannibal emerged into the Po Valley of northern Italy, with perhaps 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a handful of elephants. It was a battered army, but its arrival stunned the ancient world. Rome had expected to fight in Spain or Africa. Instead, Hannibal stood at their doorstep. The first clashes in Italy. Rome scrambled to respond. Consuls led legions north, seeking to block Hannibal's advance. But Hannibal struck first. At the Ticinus River, his cavalry outmaneuvered Roman horsemen, scattering them. At the Trebia River in 218 BCE, he lured a Roman army into an ambush, using hidden troops to crush them. Each victory emboldened Hannibal and attracted Gallic allies. Rome's legions, used to facing disorganized tribal foes, now confronted a general who combined cunning with discipline, blending Iberian infantry, Gallic warriors, Numidian cavalry, and elephants into a lethal force. Why Hannibal's strategy worked. Hannibal understood that Rome's strength lay in its allies. To defeat the Republic, he could not simply win battles, he had to break its coalition. By invading Italy, he hoped to inspire defections among Rome's allies, particularly in the south. Each victory weakened Rome's prestige, making allies question its invincibility. Each defeat bled Rome of men and resources, straining its vast network of obligations. Hannibal was not just fighting armies, he was fighting Rome's entire system. The Roman response. Rome, stunned but unbroken, resolved to fight on. The Senate raised new armies, appointed new commanders, and prepared for a long struggle. The Republic's resilience, its ability to absorb disaster and recover, would be tested as never before. But for now, the initiative lay with Hannibal. His daring march and victories in northern Italy shook the Republic to its core. The stage was set for even greater clashes, the battles of Trasimene and Cannae, where Rome would face its darkest hours. Reflection. The opening of the Second Punic War reveals both Hannibal's genius and Rome's resilience. Few commanders in history would dare to march an army across the Alps, fewer still could succeed. Hannibal did so, and with brilliance, turning a desperate gamble into a masterstroke that changed the course of history. Yet Rome did not collapse. Its Senate refused peace, its citizens endured loss, and its allies, at least for now, remained loyal. The struggle ahead would be long, brutal, and unforgettable. Closing image. Picture Hannibal's army descending from the snowy peaks of the Alps into the green plains of Italy. Soldiers stumble from exhaustion, elephants trumpet in the cold, horses snort clouds of breath. Ahead lies the Valley, rich and fertile. Behind lies death and suffering. But Hannibal has done the impossible, he has brought war to Rome's heartland. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will follow Hannibal's campaign deeper into Italy, the ambush at Lake Trasimene, the disaster at Cannae, and Rome's struggle to endure its greatest defeats. When Hannibal descended from the Alps in 218 BCE, he achieved the impossible. His battered but determined army had crossed mountains thought impassable, surviving snow, ice, and hostile tribes. Rome, stunned by his audacity, rushed to meet him in northern Italy. The first clashes at the Ticinus and Trebia rivers ended in Roman defeat, as Hannibal's cavalry and cunning tactics overwhelmed the legions. Yet these were only preludes. Over the next 2 years, Hannibal would deliver blows so devastating that they nearly destroyed the Republic. This is the story of Rome's darkest hour, the years of Trasimene and Cannae, when entire armies were lost, allies wavered, and the very survival of the Republic hung in the balance. The strategy of Hannibal. Hannibal's aim was clear. He could not destroy Rome in a single stroke, its manpower and resilience were too vast. Instead, he sought to erode its strength by shattering its armies and breaking its alliances. If enough Italian communities deserted Rome, the Republic's coalition would unravel. Thus, Hannibal avoided direct assaults on the city of Rome. Instead, he marched across Italy, luring Roman armies into battles he could win, spreading fear and doubt. Each victory, he hoped, would inspire defections. The ambush at Lake Trasimene, 217 BCE. In the spring of 217 BCE, Hannibal advanced into Etruria, devastating the countryside. Rome sent the consul Gaius Flaminius to intercept him. Flaminius, rash and eager for glory, pursued Hannibal without caution. Hannibal set a trap. Near Lake Trasimene, in a narrow valley between hills and water, he hid his troops in the wooded slopes. As Flaminius marched his army along the road, Hannibal's forces descended on all sides. The ambush was total. Roman soldiers were cut down, drowned in the lake, or scattered. Flaminius himself was slain. Tens of thousands perished. Ancient writers called it the largest ambush in history. Rome reeled. Panic swept the city. Rumors claimed Hannibal was marching on Rome itself. The dictator Fabius Maximus. In the face of disaster, Rome appointed a dictator, a temporary magistrate given supreme power in emergencies. The man chosen was Quintus Fabius Maximus, remembered ever after as cunctator, the delayer. Fabius adopted a strategy of caution. He avoided pitched battles, shadowed Hannibal's movements, harassed his supply lines, and denied him opportunities for glory. It was a war of attrition, frustrating Hannibal but unpopular in Rome. Romans, proud and impatient, scorned Fabius' caution. They wanted victory, not delay. When his term ended, new consuls prepared to confront Hannibal directly. The disaster at Cannae, 216 BCE. In 216 BCE, Rome assembled one of the largest armies in its history, perhaps 80,000 men. The consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro led the force south to confront Hannibal near the town of Cannae in Apulia. Hannibal, with perhaps half as many troops, chose the battlefield carefully, a flat plain ideal for cavalry. The battle began with Roman legions pressing forward in massive columns, seeking to smash through Hannibal's center. Hannibal deliberately placed his weakest troops, Gauls and Iberians, in the middle, forming a bulge that bent under Roman pressure. As the Romans advanced, the Carthaginian center fell back, drawing them in. Meanwhile, Hannibal's African infantry held firm on the flanks. His cavalry, led by the brilliant Numidian horsemen, routed the Roman cavalry and encircled the infantry. The trap closed. Surrounded on all sides, the Roman army was slaughtered. Ancient sources claim up to 50,000 to 70,000 Romans were killed in a single day, including senators, generals, and elite knights. It was one of the most catastrophic defeats in military history. Rome's darkest hour. News of Cannae plunged Rome into despair. The Republic had lost the heart of its army, the cream of its citizenry. Allies across Italy wavered. Some defected. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, went over to Hannibal. In the south, many Greek and Samnite communities followed. Philip V of Macedon allied with Carthage, threatening Rome from across the Adriatic. Rome's enemies believed the Republic finished. Yet Rome did not sue for peace. Unlike other states that might have surrendered after such devastation, Rome steeled itself for endurance. The Roman response. The Senate decreed extraordinary measures. Citizens contributed wealth to rebuild armies. Slaves were promised freedom if they fought. Boys barely of age were conscripted. Religious rituals were performed to appease the gods. Most crucially, Rome refused to negotiate with Hannibal. Even in defeat, the Senate declared that the Republic would fight on until victory. Why Hannibal did not march on Rome? After Cannae, many wondered why Hannibal did not march directly on Rome. Ancient historians debated the question. Some claimed his cavalry commander, Maharbal, urged it, saying, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but not how to use it." Hannibal allegedly replied that time, not rashness, would decide. In truth, Hannibal lacked the resources for a siege. Rome's walls were strong, its citizens resolute. His strategy remained one of erosion, win allies, weaken Rome's coalition, force surrender through attrition. The long war ahead. Despite his brilliance, Hannibal could not deliver a final blow. Rome's allies in central Italy remained loyal, the Republic's reserves of manpower were vast. Slowly, cautiously, Rome adapted. It rebuilt armies, adopted Fabian tactics, and turned the war into one of endurance. Hannibal remained in Italy for more than a decade, undefeated in battle but unable to force Rome's submission. The war would shift, eventually, to Spain, Sicily, and Africa. But in 216 BCE, after Cannae, it seemed the Republic stood on the edge of destruction. Reflection. The battles of Trasimene and Cannae remind us of Rome's paradox, a state that could suffer disasters almost beyond comprehension, yet rise again. Hannibal's genius delivered some of the greatest victories in history, but Rome's resilience, its refusal to surrender, ensured that those victories were not enough. In these darkest hours, the Republic showed the quality that defined it: endurance. No matter how many defeats, no matter how many armies lost, Rome would fight on. Closing image. Picture the field of Cannae after the battle. The plain is littered with Roman shields, their eagle standards captured or broken. The dust settles on tens of thousands of fallen soldiers. Hannibal surveys the field, master of the day. Yet in Rome, even as families mourn, the Senate debates not peace but war. The Republic bleeds, but it does not break. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will follow the tide of the Second Punic War as Rome adapts, Fabius delaying tactics, Scipio's rise in Spain, and the slow turning of fortune that would carry the Republic from despair to triumph. The Second Punic War had tested Rome as never before. Hannibal's genius nearly destroyed the Republic, but Rome endured, adapted, and ultimately triumphed. With Scipio Africanus' victory at Zama in 202 BCE, Carthage was broken, its empire in Spain seized, its power diminished. Yet Rome's triumph did not end with Carthage. Even as the Republic consolidated its dominance in the western Mediterranean, new horizons opened in the east. There, among the fractured kingdoms that had once belonged to Alexander the Great, Rome encountered new allies, rivals, and opportunities. The wars that followed, the Macedonian Wars, the Seleucid War, and interventions in Greece, would transform Rome from a regional power into a Mediterranean empire. The Greek world after Alexander. A century earlier, Alexander the Great had conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India. After his death in 323 BCE, his generals divided the spoils, carving out kingdoms. Macedonia under the Antigonid dynasty. Egypt under the Ptolemies. Asia under the Seleucids. These Hellenistic monarchies were rich and cultured, heirs to Greek philosophy, science, and art. Yet they were also unstable, plagued by dynastic feuds and rivalries. For Rome, long an outsider to Greek affairs, this world offered both opportunity and danger. First contact, the First Macedonian War, 214 to 205 BCE. Rome's first clash with the Greek East came during the Second Punic War itself. In 215 BCE, Hannibal forged an alliance with Philip V of Macedon, who sought to expand his influence while Rome was distracted. Rome responded by sending small forces to harass Philip, allying with Greek states like the Aetolian League and Pergamum. The fighting was limited, more skirmish than war, but it marked Rome's entry into Greek politics. The First Macedonian War ended inconclusively in 205 BCE, with Rome too focused on Hannibal to commit fully. But the seeds were planted. Rome had tasted involvement in the East, and it would return. The Second Macedonian War, 200 to 197 BCE. After Hannibal's defeat, Rome turned its gaze across the Adriatic. Philip V, emboldened, threatened Greek city-states and allied with the Seleucids. Greek appeals for help reached the Senate. In 200 BCE, Rome declared war. At first, many Romans hesitated. Why should legions fight across the sea? Yet the Senate saw both honor and security at stake. To leave Philip unchecked was to invite new threats. To intervene was to spread Rome's influence. The war culminated in the Battle of Cynocephaly in 197 BCE. There, Roman legions met the Macedonian phalanx, the fearsome formation of long-speared infantry that had once conquered the world under Alexander. The clash was decisive. The phalanx, powerful on flat ground, proved unwieldy on broken terrain. Roman maniples, flexible and adaptable, outflanked and overwhelmed it. Philip was defeated, forced to cede influence in Greece. Rome declared that Greece was now free. A phrase that resonated deeply with Greek pride but masked Rome's growing dominance. Rome and the idea of Greek freedom. In the aftermath of Cynocephaly, the Roman general Titus Quinctius Flamininus proclaimed at the Isthmian Games that Rome had liberated the Greeks from Macedonian rule. The crowds erupted in joy, hailing Rome as a protector. Yet this freedom was conditional. Rome expected gratitude, alliances, and deference. In time, many Greeks realized that Roman freedom meant Roman oversight. Still, for now, Rome was celebrated as a champion of liberty. The Seleucid threat. Even as Macedon waned, another challenge arose: the Seleucid Empire under King Antiochus III. Having expanded into Asia Minor and Greece, Antiochus posed as the new defender of Hellenism. He was joined by none other than Hannibal, now an exile from Carthage, who advised the Seleucid court. Rome could not ignore the threat. In 192 BCE, Antiochus landed in Greece, claiming to liberate it from Roman influence. The war with Antiochus, 192 to 188 BCE. The conflict, known as the Roman-Seleucid War, pitted Rome and its Greek allies against Antiochus' forces. At first, Antiochus seemed formidable, but Roman discipline and alliances tipped the balance. The decisive clash came in 190 BCE at the Battle of Magnesia in Asia Minor. Roman legions, supported by Pergamene allies, faced Antiochus' vast army of infantry, cavalry, and war elephants. Once again, the flexibility of the legions triumphed over the rigidity of Hellenistic formations. Antiochus was routed. The subsequent Treaty of Apamea, 188 BCE, stripped the Seleucids of Asia Minor, imposed heavy indemnities, and limited their fleet. Rome did not annex territory directly but handed lands to allies like Pergamum and Rhodes, expanding its influence without direct rule. The Third Macedonian War, 171 to 168 BCE. Rome's interventions did not end with Antiochus. In 171 BCE, conflict flared again with Macedon, now ruled by Perseus, son of Philip V. Perseus sought to revive Macedonian strength and challenged Rome's allies. Rome responded with overwhelming force. At the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, legions once more faced the Macedonian phalanx. On rough ground, the phalanx lost cohesion, and Roman maniples exploited the gaps. The Macedonians were slaughtered, Perseus captured. Macedonia was dissolved as a kingdom, divided into 4 client republics. Greek independence, such as it was, shrank further under Roman oversight. The sack of Corinth, 146 BCE. By the mid-2nd century BCE, tensions in Greece boiled over. In 146 BCE, after revolts, Rome marched against Corinth, one of the proudest Greek cities. The city was captured and destroyed, its inhabitants killed or enslaved. That same year, Carthage, Rome's old rival, was also obliterated in the Third Punic War. The twin destructions of Corinth and Carthage symbolized Rome's unchallenged supremacy east and west. Consequences of the Eastern Wars. Rome's wars in the east had lasting consequences. End of Macedonian power, the Antigonid dynasty was extinguished. Macedonia became a Roman province by 148 BCE. Weakening of the Seleucids, their empire declined, eventually falling to internal strife and external pressure. Expansion of Roman influence, though Rome often proclaimed it sought no empire, its presence in Greece and Asia grew unavoidable. Cultural exchange, Greek art, philosophy, and literature flowed into Rome, profoundly shaping Roman culture. The conquerors were, in many ways, conquered by Greek ideas. Reflection. Rome's entry into the eastern Mediterranean marked a turning point. No longer was the Republic of Power confined to Italy or the Western Seas. Now it was an arbiter in Greek affairs, a force in Asia, a power whose legions had humbled kingdoms that once followed Alexander. Yet with this expansion came new challenges. Wealth poured into Rome, but so did corruption and inequality. Senators grew rich on spoils, slaves flooded the countryside, and politics grew more bitter. The Republic was victorious abroad but increasingly strained at home. Closing image. Picture the Isthmian Games in 196 BCE. A Roman general, Flamininus, stands before a crowd of Greeks, proclaiming freedom. The stadium erupts in cheers, Greeks weeping with joy. Yet in the background, Roman legions march, standards gleaming, a reminder that this freedom is guarded and defined by Rome. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will return west to witness the Third Punic War, the final destruction of Carthage, and the symbolic moment when Rome secured mastery of the Mediterranean. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Rome stood unchallenged as the dominant power of the Mediterranean. The Republic had crushed Hannibal in the Second Punic War, subdued Macedonia and Greece, humbled the Seleucid Empire, and extended its influence across the seas. Yet one old rival remained, Carthage, the city that had once nearly destroyed Rome. Though Carthage was weakened, stripped of its empire, and bound by treaty, its very existence continued to haunt Roman memory. For a generation raised in the shadow of Hannibal's invasions, the thought of Carthage recovering strength was intolerable. In the Senate, voices whispered a phrase again and again, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE, was short but brutal. Unlike the epic struggles of earlier wars, it was less a contest of equals than an act of extermination. Rome's aim was not negotiation, not subjugation, but annihilation. Carthage after Zama. Following its defeat in 202 BCE, Carthage lived under harsh terms. It lost Spain, paid a crushing indemnity, and was forbidden to wage war without Rome's consent. Its navy was dismantled, its empire gone. Yet Carthage did not collapse. Over the decades, its merchants rebuilt wealth through trade. Its fields, fertile as ever, produced abundant grain. The indemnity was paid off earlier than required. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Carthage was prosperous again, economically vibrant, though politically shackled. This prosperity alarmed some Romans. They remembered Hannibal, remembered Cannae, remembered the fires of Italy. To them, a thriving Carthage was a latent threat. Cato the Elder and the call for war. Among the most vocal advocates for Carthage's destruction was Cato the Elder, a stern Roman statesman. According to tradition, Cato ended every speech, no matter its subject, with the words, Carthago delenda est. For Cato and others, it was not enough that Carthage was weak. Its very survival was dangerous. Rome's security, they argued, required its complete destruction. The spark of war. The final crisis came from Africa itself. Carthage's neighbor, Numidia, ruled by King Massinissa, Rome's ally since the days of Scipio Africanus, repeatedly raided Carthaginian lands. Carthage, forbidden by treaty from waging war without Rome's approval, appealed for help. Rome turned a blind eye. At last, Carthage fought back, raising an army to defend itself. Rome seized on this as a breach of treaty. In 149 BCE, it declared war. The Roman demands. At first, Rome did not intend to annihilate Carthage outright. But its demands grew ever harsher. Roman envoys required Carthage to disarm completely, surrendering all weapons and war machines. The Carthaginians, though humiliated, complied. Then Rome made a final demand. The entire population must abandon the city and relocate inland, leaving Carthage itself to be destroyed. For the Carthaginians, this was intolerable. Their city was their identity, their pride, their sanctuary. To abandon it was to cease being Carthaginian. They chose instead to resist. The Siege of Carthage. Thus began the Siege of Carthage, one of the most desperate defenses in ancient history. Stripped of weapons, the Carthaginians forged new arms from whatever they could find. Temples were stripped of metal, citizens worked day and night to make weapons. Women cut their hair to make ropes for catapults. Rome, confident of easy victory, soon realized the task would not be simple. Carthage's walls were massive, its harbor well defended. Year after year, Roman assaults were repelled. The siege dragged on, testing the patience of the Republic. Scipio Aemilianus. In 147 BCE, command passed to Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption of Scipio Africanus. Unlike earlier commanders, Scipio was disciplined and determined. He tightened the blockade, cutting off supplies, and prepared for a final assault. In 146 BCE, Roman forces stormed the city. Fighting was brutal, street by street, house by house. Carthaginian defenders fought with desperate courage, but the end was inevitable. After days of slaughter, Carthage fell. The destruction. The aftermath was grim. The city was burned, its inhabitants killed or enslaved. Ancient sources claim the destruction lasted 17 days, flames consuming temples, homes, and harbors. By the end, Carthage was a ruin. Its territory in Africa was annexed as the province of Africa Proconsularis. Rome's old rival was no more. Symbolism and legacy. The destruction of Carthage symbolized more than victory. It was the end of a century-long rivalry, the closing of the Punic Wars that had shaped Rome's rise. The Republic, once nearly destroyed by Hannibal, had avenged itself utterly. Yet it also revealed a darker side of Rome, its capacity not only to conquer but to annihilate. Where once Carthage had stood, one of the great cities of the Mediterranean was reduced to ash. Reflection. The Third Punic War was not Rome's most glorious conflict. There was no Hannibal to test its legions, no epic battles to showcase generalship. Instead, it was an act of ruthless determination, the elimination of a rival for security's sake. For Romans, it brought closure. For the Mediterranean, it marked the end of Carthage's centuries-long role as a great power. From this point onward, the Western Mediterranean was wholly Roman. Closing image. Picture Carthage in 146 BCE. Its once proud harbors lie silent, ships burned or sunk. Streets are choked with rubble, temples blackened by smoke. Roman soldiers march through ruins, standards raised, the eagle triumphant. And in the Forum back in Rome, senators declare the old phrase fulfilled: Carthage has been destroyed. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will turn inward to the Republic itself, exploring the domestic strains that arose as conquest brought wealth, slaves, and inequality, challenges that threatened the Republic's stability from within. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Rome was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. Carthage was in ruins, Corinth lay sacked, Macedon had fallen, and the Seleucid Empire had been humbled. Roman armies had marched farther and triumphed more often than any in history. The Republic stood at the pinnacle of power. Yet beneath the glory, cracks spread within Rome itself. The very conquests that enriched the state also destabilized its society. Wealth flowed into the city, but it pooled in the hands of a few. Slaves arrived by the hundreds of thousands, displacing free labor. Veterans returned to find their farms ruined. Senators grew richer, ordinary citizens poorer. This was the paradox of the Republic, victorious abroad, vulnerable at home. The transformation of wealth. Every conquest brought treasure, gold, silver, art, and tribute. Spoils from Corinth, Carthage, and Asia Minor filled Roman coffers. Generals celebrated triumphs, parading captives and riches through the streets. But this wealth did not spread evenly. The Senate, composed of Rome's elite, profited most. Senators acquired vast estates, latifundia, worked by slaves. Equites, the business class, enriched themselves through tax farming, banking, and contracts in the provinces. Meanwhile, small farmers, the backbone of the Republic's citizen armies, struggled. Wars kept them away from their land, debts mounted, and many were forced to sell. The flood of slaves. Rome's victories brought an unprecedented influx of slaves. From Sicily, Greece, and the East, captives arrived in chains. By the late Republic, Italy's population may have included more slaves than free citizens in some regions. Slaves worked in households, workshops, and especially on latifundia. They tended vineyards, herded flocks, and harvested grain. Their labor enriched elites but displaced free farmers, who could not compete with unpaid work. The social consequences were immense. Freedmen and urban poor swelled the city of Rome, dependent on patronage and handouts. The countryside emptied of its independent citizen farmers, weakening the very class that had sustained the Republic's armies. The decline of the farmer. For centuries, the Roman ideal was the independent farmer-citizen, modest, self-reliant, devoted to land, family, and republic. Military service was tied to property. To fight for Rome was to defend one's farm. But by the 2nd century BCE, this balance faltered. Long campaigns kept farmers from their land. Debt and competition from latifundia drove them to ruin. Returning veterans often found their fields neglected, seized, or unsalvageable. Many drifted to Rome, seeking work or bread. The city swelled with unemployed citizens, while senators grew ever richer. The rise of inequality. The gulf between rich and poor widened dramatically. Senators flaunted wealth with villas, luxuries, and imported art. Equites profited from provincial exploitation. Meanwhile, the urban poor survived on irregular labor, dependence on patrons, or free distributions of grain. This inequality bred resentment. Romans prided themselves on their republic, yet more and more citizens felt excluded from its prosperity. The tension simmered, awaiting leaders who would channel it into reform or revolution. The provincial burden. Rome's provinces, newly conquered territories like Sicily, Spain, and Asia, were sources of wealth, but also exploitation. Governors, drawn from the senatorial elite, wielded immense power. Many abused it, extorting locals, skimming taxes, and enriching themselves. For provincials, Rome was both protector and predator. Tribute flowed to the capital, while resentment festered abroad. Yet the spoils only widened inequality at home, as senators and equites grew richer at the expense of subjects and citizens alike. The erosion of republican virtues. Romans had long cherished values of simplicity, discipline, and service. But conquests brought luxury. Greek art, Eastern luxuries, and new philosophies flooded Rome. Traditionalists like Cato the Elder decried the decay of old morals. They feared Rome was losing its rugged virtues to indulgence and greed. This cultural anxiety merged with economic inequality. The Republic, once a community of farmers and soldiers, seemed increasingly an oligarchy of the rich ruling over a restless mass of poor. Early signs of unrest. The social strains erupted in periodic revolts. In Sicily, slave uprisings broke out in the late 2nd century BCE, when desperate captives rose against their masters. These rebellions, though crushed, revealed the fragility of a society built on mass slavery. In Rome itself, the cries for reform grew louder. Citizens demanded relief from debt, fairer distribution of land, and checks on senatorial greed. Yet the Senate, jealous of its privileges, resisted. The stage was set for the arrival of reformers who would challenge the system, most famously, the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Reflection. The mid-2nd century BCE was a paradox. Outwardly, Rome was triumphant, unmatched in power and prestige. Inwardly, it was troubled, its social fabric fraying. The conquests that made Rome an empire also undermined the very class, the small farmer, that had made the Republic strong. The Republic's institutions were not designed for empire. Its Senate managed conquests for its own benefit, its assemblies struggled to represent citizens scattered across Italy, and its courts were dominated by elites. Inequality, slavery, and corruption were not temporary problems but structural flaws. Closing image. Picture Rome after the fall of Carthage. Senators parade spoils in triumph, their villas filled with riches. Merchants count silver from Asia. In the countryside, small farms lie abandoned, swallowed by vast estates worked by slaves. In the city, the poor gather in crowded tenements, restless and hungry. The Republic gleams with power but trembles with tension. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will meet the Gracchi brothers, tribunes who dared to reform land laws and challenge senatorial privilege, and whose fate revealed the Republic's growing instability. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Rome's greatness concealed deep fractures. Victories abroad had brought wealth, slaves, and provinces, but also inequality, corruption, and the decline of the independent farmer. The Republic's social fabric frayed, as senators grew richer, while citizens drifted into poverty. It was in this atmosphere that two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, emerged as reformers. Both were tribunes of the plebs, elected to defend the common people. Both sought to redress inequality by restoring land to citizens and curbing senatorial excess. And both met violent ends, killed by fellow Romans. Their story marks a turning point. For centuries, Rome had prided itself on political compromise, on orderly debate between Senate and people. With the Gracchi, that balance shattered. Violence entered the heart of Roman politics, setting the stage for decades of civil strife. The background of the Gracchi. The Gracchi came from a distinguished family. Their father, Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, had been a respected general and consul. Their mother, Cornelia, was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, the conqueror of Hannibal. Widowed young, Cornelia raised her children with a strong sense of duty and honor. The brothers inherited not only noble lineage but also sympathy for the plight of the poor. They saw firsthand the widening gap between rich and poor, the displacement of farmers by slaves, and the corruption of the Senate. Tiberius Gracchus and the Agrarian Law. In 133 BCE, Tiberius Gracchus was elected tribune of the plebs. Alarmed by the decline of small farmers, he proposed a bold reform, to redistribute public land, ager publicus, that wealthy elites had seized, and grant it back to poor citizens. The law struck at the heart of senatorial privilege. Many senators had enriched themselves by occupying vast tracts of public land, treating it as private property. Tiberius' reform threatened their wealth and power. Conflict with the Senate. The Senate resisted fiercely. Tiberius bypassed them, appealing directly to the people's assembly. This act of defiance enraged the elite, but it won popular support. The Agrarian Law passed, and a commission, led by Tiberius, his brother, and his father-in-law, began redistributing land. Tiberius went further, seeking re-election as tribune for a second consecutive year, unprecedented and illegal in Roman custom. He argued it was necessary to protect his reforms from senatorial reversal. The Senate saw it as ambition, even tyranny. The death of Tiberius. In the summer of 133 BCE, tensions boiled over. On election day, senators and their supporters armed themselves with clubs, furniture, and stones. They stormed the assembly, attacking Tiberius and his followers. Tiberius was beaten to death, along with hundreds of his supporters. His body was thrown into the Tiber. For the first time in centuries, political conflict in Rome had ended in organized bloodshed. Gaius Gracchus and renewed reform. A decade later, in 123 BCE, Tiberius' younger brother Gaius Gracchus was elected tribune. Brilliant, fiery, and eloquent, he carried forward his brother's legacy with even broader reforms. Gaius proposed expanding land redistribution, establishing colonies abroad for poor citizens, fixing grain prices to aid the urban poor, granting equites greater power by allowing them to serve as jurors in courts judging corrupt governors. These measures threatened senatorial dominance and gained wide support from both citizens and equites. The backlash. But Gaius went further, proposing citizenship rights for Rome's Italian allies. This radical idea divided his supporters. Many citizens resisted, unwilling to share privileges with Italians. The Senate seized the opportunity to undermine him, backing a rival tribune and portraying Gaius as a dangerous radical. The death of Gaius. In 121 BCE, violence returned. Tensions between supporters of Gaius and the Senate escalated into street fighting on the Aventine Hill. The Senate, for the first time, issued the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a decree granting consuls emergency powers to defend the state. Armed forces clashed. Gaius, cornered, ordered a slave to kill him to avoid capture. Thousands of his supporters were executed. The legacy of the Gracchi. The deaths of the Gracchi marked a turning point in Roman history. For centuries, disputes had been resolved through debate, compromise, and law. Now violence had entered politics. Assassinations, riots, and civil strife would become recurring features of the late Republic. The issues they raised, land reform, citizenship, inequality, did not disappear. Instead, they grew sharper, fueling future conflicts. Leaders like Marius, Sulla, and Caesar would grapple with the same problems, often through force. The Gracchi were remembered as martyrs for the people, reformers who sought justice but fell to aristocratic violence. Their story embodied the Republic's tragic inability to reform itself peacefully. Reflection. The tale of the Gracchi is one of idealism and tragedy. They sought to heal the Republic's wounds, to restore balance between rich and poor, to defend the citizen farmer. Yet their reforms threatened entrenched interests, and their methods alarmed conservatives. The Republic, unable to compromise, answered reform with violence. With their deaths, the Republic crossed a threshold. Politics was no longer safe, dissent could mean death. The precedent of bloodshed poisoned the Republic, ensuring that future crises would escalate into violence. Closing image. Picture Rome after the death of Gaius. The streets of the Aventine are strewn with bodies, torches smolder, and soldiers patrol. In the Forum, senators debate calmly, as if order has been restored. Yet beneath the marble and authority lies something fragile, a republic where blood has stained politics, and where the sword now shadows the law. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will see the consequences unfold, the rise of Gaius Marius, military reforms that reshaped the legions, and how the balance of power shifted from citizen soldiers to generals commanding armies loyal to themselves. After the deaths of the Gracchi brothers, the Republic entered a new phase. Violence had become a tool of politics, inequality deepened, and the plight of the poor remained unresolved. Rome continued to expand abroad, but at home, unrest simmered. It was in this world that a new kind of leader emerged, not a senator of noble birth, but a man of modest origins whose career would redefine the Republic's military and political life. His name was Gaius Marius, and his reforms would transform the Roman army from a citizen militia into a professional force. This change, born of necessity, would carry grave consequences. Soldiers would come to see their loyalty not to the Senate and people of Rome, but to their commanders. In Marius, we see the beginnings of the Republic's drift toward military autocracy. The rise of Gaius Marius. Marius was born around 157 BCE in Arpinum, a small town southeast of Rome. Unlike most of Rome's political elite, he came from a humble background, a numen, novus homo, without noble lineage. Yet through talent, discipline, and ambition, he rose in politics and the military. By the 120s BCE, he had served with distinction in Spain and Africa, earning a reputation for toughness and competence. He married into the influential family of the Julii, connecting him to Rome's aristocracy. Still, many nobles scorned him as an outsider, a rough soldier unsuited for high politics. Marius proved them wrong. The Jugurthine War, 112 to 105 BCE. Rome's next great conflict erupted in North Africa, in the kingdom of Numidia. Its king, Jugurtha, manipulated Roman politics with bribes, dragging the war into a quagmire. In 107 BCE, Marius was elected consul and given command of the war. His election was remarkable, a numen rising to Rome's highest office, supported by popular resentment against a corrupt Senate. Marius reorganized the army, recruited new forces, and campaigned relentlessly. With the help of his subordinate Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Marius forced Jugurtha's surrender. Though Sulla negotiated the final capture, Marius claimed the glory, cementing his reputation. The threat of the Cimbri and Teutons. Even as Numidia fell, a far greater threat emerged, migrating tribes from the north, the Cimbri and Teutons. These peoples, originating from northern Europe, swept through Gaul, defeating Roman armies in a series of disasters. In 105 BCE, at Orazio, Rome suffered one of its worst defeats, with tens of thousands killed. Panic gripped the Republic. In desperation, the people turned to Marius. He was elected consul again, and again, and again, holding the office an unprecedented 5 times in succession. This broke the old republican norm that no man should dominate politics year after year. The Marian reforms. To face the northern threat, Marius transformed the Roman army. His reforms included abolishing property requirements. Traditionally, only landowning citizens could serve, as military service was tied to defending one's farm. Marius opened recruitment to the Capaitensi, the poorest citizens who owned nothing but their heads. Standardized training and equipment. The state now supplied arms and armor, removing the burden from individuals. Soldiers were trained rigorously and became professionals, rather than part-time farmers. Cohort system. Marius reorganized the legion into cohorts, larger, more flexible units than the traditional maniples. This improved cohesion and maneuverability. Veterans' rewards. Marius promised land to his soldiers upon retirement, binding their loyalty not to the Senate but to him, their general. These reforms saved Rome militarily, but politically, they planted seeds of instability. Soldiers now depended on generals for land and livelihood, and generals, in turn, could wield their armies as political tools. Victories against the barbarians. With his new professional army, Marius confronted the invaders. In 102 BCE, at Aquae Sextii, he annihilated the Teutons. In 101 BCE, at Vercelli, he destroyed the Cimbri, ending the northern threat once and for all. Rome rejoiced. Marius was hailed as the third founder of Rome, after Romulus and Camillus. He stood as the Republic's greatest general, the savior of the state. Political consequences. Yet Marius' dominance bred tension. His reliance on the populares, the political faction appealing to the people, set him against the conservative Senate. His alliance with tribunes like Saturninus, who pursued radical reforms, led to violence in the streets. By the late 90s BCE, Marius' prestige waned. He retired from politics, only to return when new crises arose. The Social War, 91 to 88 BCE. In 91 BCE, Rome's Italian allies rose in revolt. Long denied citizenship, they demanded rights equal to Romans. The Social War was brutal, with allies fighting for recognition as full citizens. Marius, aging but still respected, commanded troops. Though his health faltered, his reputation remained formidable. Ultimately, Rome granted citizenship to the Italians, integrating them into the Republic. Rivalry with Sulla. It was during the Social War that Marius' path fatally crossed with his former subordinate, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla, ambitious and ruthless, won fame in battle and claimed credit for victories. Tensions flared between the old general and the rising star. In 88 BCE, when war against King Mithridates of Pontus broke out in the east, the Senate gave command to Sulla. The populares, led by Marius, transferred it to him instead. Enraged, Sulla marched his legions on Rome itself, an unprecedented act. Civil war erupted. Marius fled, then returned with his supporters, seizing the city in bloody vengeance. Thousands were killed, senators executed, enemies purged. For the first time in history, Roman armies had been used to seize Rome itself. Marius, old and ill, was elected consul for a seventh time in 86 BCE. He died soon after, leaving Sulla to dominate the Republic. Legacy of Marius. Marius' reforms saved Rome and created the foundation for future military dominance. Yet they also changed the Republic irrevocably. The professional army ensured Rome's strength but made soldiers loyal to generals, not the Senate. The erosion of republican norms, as Marius held consulships year after year, weakened political traditions. His rivalry with Sulla inaugurated a cycle of civil wars that would plague the Republic until its end. Marius was remembered as both a savior and a destroyer, the man who defended Rome from foreign threats but unleashed forces that undermined its stability. Reflection. Marius embodies the Republic's contradictions. He was a newman who rose on talent, a general who saved the state, a reformer who opened opportunity to the poor. Yet his reforms, meant to preserve Rome, destabilized it. He gave Rome victory abroad but discord at home. With Marius, the Republic entered a new era, one where generals, not senators, commanded the loyalty of legions, and where the Republic's fate increasingly rested on the ambitions of powerful men. Closing image. Picture Marius, aged and weary, returning to Rome after decades of victories. The Senate greets him coldly, the people with cheers. Around him march soldiers, no longer farmers returning to fields, but professionals awaiting his promises of land. In this moment lies both triumph and tragedy, the Republic stronger than ever, yet forever changed. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will follow the career of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Marius' rival, whose dictatorship would leave scars on the Republic and set further precedents for autocracy. By the time of Gaius Marius' final days, Rome was already trembling. Civil war had touched its streets, armies had been turned against citizens, and politics had become a battlefield. Into this volatile world stepped Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man as brilliant as he was ruthless. Sulla rose from relative obscurity to command Rome's armies, defeating enemies abroad and rivals at home. He was the first Roman to march on Rome with his legions, the first to seize dictatorship by force, and the first to use proscriptions, state-sanctioned lists of enemies marked for death and confiscation. His dictatorship revealed the fragility of the Republic's institutions and left a legacy of violence that future leaders, Pompey, Caesar, even Octavian, would exploit. The early life of Sulla. Born in 138 BCE to a patrician family that had fallen into poverty, Sulla was unusual among Rome's elite. He grew up without wealth or prestige, living modestly and mingling with entertainers, actors, and commoners. Yet he possessed sharp wit, charm, and ambition. Sulla's fortunes changed during the Jugurthine War, where he served under Marius. It was Sulla who negotiated Jugurtha's capture, securing his first taste of fame. Though Marius claimed the victory, Sulla's role planted seeds of rivalry. The Social War, 91 to 88 BCE. Sulla's true rise came during the Social War, when Rome's Italian allies revolted for citizenship rights. As a commander, Sulla displayed brilliance, winning critical victories. He earned the coveted Corona Graminia, the grass crown, Rome's highest military honor, awarded by his soldiers for saving an army. By 88 BCE, Sulla was one of Rome's most celebrated generals. His reputation outshone Marius, now an aging veteran. Their rivalry, once simmering, boiled over. The Mithridatic War and the First March on Rome. In the east, a new threat loomed. King Mithridates VI of Pontus, a formidable ruler in Asia Minor, launched a brutal campaign against Roman power. He ordered massacres of tens of thousands of Italians living in Asia, shocking the Republic. Rome prepared for war, and the Senate appointed Sulla to command. But Marius, unwilling to cede glory, maneuvered through the popular assemblies to transfer command to himself. Outraged, Sulla took an unprecedented step. He marched his legions on Rome. In 88 BCE, for the first time in history, a Roman general used his army to seize the city. Streets that had known debate now echoed with soldiers' boots. Sulla drove Marius into exile and restored his command. The Republic's norms lay shattered. Violence, not law, had decided power. Campaign against Mithridates. Sulla departed east to fight Mithridates, leaving Rome in chaos. His campaigns in Greece were brilliant. At Chaeronea and Orchomenus, he crushed massive armies with tactical genius, reasserting Roman supremacy in the region. Yet even as he triumphed abroad, events at home unraveled. The return of Marius and the Marian Terror. While Sulla was in Greece, Marius returned with his supporters. Seizing Rome, he unleashed a purge of Sulla's allies. Senators were executed, their heads displayed in the Forum. For months, Rome endured terror. Marius, old and sick, died soon after, but his faction remained. When Sulla returned victorious in 83 BCE, civil war resumed. The Second March on Rome. Sulla landed in Italy with his loyal legions. Over 2 years, he fought his way to Rome, defeating Marian forces in bloody battles. By 82 BCE, he entered the city as master. At the Colline Gate, his army crushed the last resistance. The Republic was his. The dictatorship. Sulla declared himself dictator legibus scribendis et re publici constituenti, dictator for writing laws and reconstituting the Republic. Unlike past dictatorships, meant for short crises, Sulla's power was indefinite. His dictatorship was ruthless. He instituted proscriptions, public lists of enemies whose lives and property were forfeit. Men were hunted in the streets, their wealth seized, their families ruined. Thousands perished. Sulla rewarded followers with confiscated estates, cementing loyalty through blood and spoils. Sulla's reforms. Amid the terror, Sulla pursued reforms aimed at strengthening the Senate and weakening the populace. Senate expansion. He increased the Senate's size, filling it with loyal supporters. Limiting tribunes, the tribunate, once a powerful tool of reform, was neutered. Tribunes could no longer propose legislation or hold further office after serving. Cursus honorum, he codified the sequence of political offices, enforcing strict rules on age and order. Courts and provinces, he reorganized courts, giving senators control, and established clearer governance of provinces. Sulla believed he was restoring the republic to stability, protecting it from populist radicals like the Gracchi and Marius. In truth, his dictatorship deepened divisions. The resignation. In 79 BCE, astonishingly, Sulla resigned. He laid down power, retired to private life, and died the next year. His departure shocked contemporaries. No dictator had ever voluntarily surrendered authority. Yet the republic did not return to health. Sulla's terror had scarred Rome. His proscription set a precedent for political murder, his marches on Rome normalized military intervention, and his reforms failed to heal social wounds. Legacy of Sulla. Sulla's legacy is complex. Military precedent. By marching on Rome, he shattered the taboo that armies must never cross the city's sacred boundary. Future generals, Pompey, Caesar, Octavian, would follow his example. Proscriptions, political violence became institutionalized. Lists of enemies marked for death would return in later civil wars. Reforms and reversals. His attempt to empower the Senate and weaken the tribunes was undone within a generation, revealing the futility of imposed order. Model of dictatorship. Though he resigned, Sulla demonstrated that one man could seize control of the republic through force. Reflection. Sulla was both restorer and destroyer. He sought to preserve the republic by strengthening its traditional elite, yet his methods undermined the very foundations of law and custom. He left behind a Rome bloodied, divided, and more accustomed than ever to violence. The republic he claimed to save was weaker for his efforts. Closing image. Picture Rome in 82 BCE. The heads of senators and equites are nailed to the rostra in the forum, their names written on public lists. Citizens hurry past in silence, fearful of being denounced. In Sulla's villa, the dictator reclines, certain that he has saved the republic. Yet in the shadows, ambition stirs among younger men who have learned that power lies not in laws, but in legions. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will see how new figures, Pompey, Crassus, and Julius Caesar, rose in the wake of Sulla's reforms and violence, turning the republic toward the age of triumvirates and civil war. The death of Sulla in 78 BCE left Rome in uneasy calm. His dictatorship had ended with his resignation, but the scars of his violence lingered. Proscriptions had slaughtered thousands, senatorial privilege had been fortified, and the populace suppressed. Yet the republic was far from stable. Inequality, unrest, and ambitious generals still loomed. Into this unsettled world rose three men whose careers would dominate the late republic: Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar. Together, they would form the first triumvirate, an informal alliance that bent the republic's institutions to their will. But their ambition, rivalry, and eventual conflict would plunge Rome into another cycle of civil war, bringing the republic ever closer to its end. Pompey the Great, the young general. Pompey was born in 106 BCE to a wealthy family of the Italian nobility. Unlike Marius or Sulla, he inherited both wealth and prestige, but his true rise came through military success. As a young man, Pompey raised his own private army during Sulla's civil wars, earning the nickname Adolescentialis Carnifex, the teenage butcher, for his ruthless efficiency. Sulla, impressed by his loyalty, entrusted him with commands despite his youth. Over the following decades, Pompey achieved remarkable victories. In Spain, he defeated the Marian general Sertorius, though only after years of brutal guerrilla fighting. Against the pirates, he was given extraordinary command in 67 BCE to clear the Mediterranean of piracy. In a matter of months, he swept the seas clean, restoring safe trade and cementing his reputation. In the east, Pompey waged war against Mithridates of Pontus, finally ending a conflict that had spanned decades. He annexed Syria, subdued Judea, and reorganized the provinces of Asia. By the 60s BCE, Pompey stood as Rome's foremost general, a conqueror celebrated with a magnificent triumph. He was hailed as Magnus, the Great. Yet the Senate, wary of his power, resisted granting land for his veterans or ratifying his eastern settlements. Pompey, frustrated, turned to political alliances outside the Senate's control. Crassus, the richest man in Rome. If Pompey embodied military glory, Crassus embodied wealth. Born around 115 BCE, he amassed a fortune through real estate, silver mines, and ruthless speculation. During Sulla's proscriptions, he enriched himself by seizing confiscated properties at bargain prices. Crassus sought glory to match his wealth. His greatest military achievement was the defeat of Spartacus and the slave revolt of 73 to 71 BCE, known as the Third Servile War. While Crassus crushed the rebellion with harsh discipline, crucifying thousands of captives along the Appian Way, Pompey, returning from Spain, claimed credit for mopping up survivors. The rivalry between Crassus and Pompey only deepened. Ambitious but insecure, Crassus longed for recognition equal to Pompey's. He poured money into politics, funding games, banquets, and bribes, building networks of clients and supporters. His wealth made him a kingmaker, but his desire for military glory would ultimately lead to disaster. Caesar, the rising star. Born in 100 BCE to the patrician Julian family, Julius Caesar was a relative of Marius through marriage. His early life was precarious. During Sulla's proscriptions, he narrowly escaped death. Ambitious and charismatic, Caesar rose through the cursus honorum, cultivating the favor of the masses with charm, generosity, and spectacle. He distinguished himself as a brilliant speaker and politician, allied with the populace. His lavish spending plunged him into debt, but his boldness and daring won him admiration. By the late 60s BCE, Caesar's rise seemed unstoppable, though he still lacked the military glory of men like Pompey. The formation of the First Triumvirate. By the late 60s BCE, all three men faced obstacles. Pompey wanted land for his veterans and ratification of his eastern settlements. Crassus wanted financial relief for the equites, the business class who had overbid on tax contracts. Caesar, seeking the consulship of 59 BCE, wanted backing for his political career. Alone, each faced senatorial resistance. Together, they could overwhelm it. Thus was born the First Triumvirate, not an official office, but a private alliance. Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar pooled their power to dominate politics. To seal the pact, Caesar married his daughter Julia to Pompey. Caesar's consulship, 59 BCE. As consul in 59 BCE, Caesar advanced the triumvir's agenda. He pushed through agrarian laws granting land to Pompey's veterans, supported Crassus' financial reforms, and laid the groundwork for his own military command. His aggressive tactics outraged the Senate, but his popularity soared. At the end of his consulship, Caesar secured a proconsular command in Gaul for 5 years, soon extended to 10. There, he would achieve the conquests that made him legendary. Caesar in Gaul. From 58 to 50 BCE, Caesar waged the Gallic Wars, subduing tribes across modern France, Belgium, and beyond. His commentaries recorded the campaigns, showcasing his genius. Highlights included defeating the Helvetii migration, crushing Germanic incursions under Ariovistus, building a bridge across the Rhine in a display of audacity. In 55 BCE, launching the first Roman expeditions into Britain. In 52 BCE, defeating the Gallic leader Vercingetorix at Alesia, one of history's most brilliant sieges. By the end, Gaul was a Roman province, and Caesar was richer and more powerful than ever. His legions were fiercely loyal, his prestige unmatched. Cracks in the triumvirate. The alliance, however, began to unravel. Julia, Pompey's beloved wife and Caesar's daughter, died in 54 BCE, weakening the personal bond between the two men. In 53 BCE, Crassus sought military glory in the east, leading an invasion of Parthia. At Carrhae, disaster struck. Crassus' army was annihilated, his legions destroyed by Parthian horse archers and cataphracts. Crassus himself was killed, his head allegedly used in a Parthian play. With Crassus dead, the triumvirate collapsed into rivalry between Caesar and Pompey. Pompey and Caesar drift apart. Pompey, now the Senate's champion, grew wary of Caesar's growing power. Rome itself descended into chaos, with street violence between political gangs led by Clodius and Milo. In 52 BCE, Pompey was appointed sole consul to restore order. He allied increasingly with the Optimates, Rome's conservative elite, and distanced himself from Caesar. The Senate, fearing Caesar's return with his legions, demanded he disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar refused, insisting on retaining his command until he could stand for consul again. Toward civil war. The Republic stood on the edge. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, now stood as his rival. The Senate, alarmed at Caesar's dominance, backed Pompey. Caesar, unwilling to surrender his command, prepared for confrontation. In 49 BCE, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River with a single legion, declaring, "Alia iacta est," the die is cast. Civil war had begun. Reflection. The story of Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar is the story of ambition colliding with a fragile republic. Together, they bent its institutions to their will. Divided, they turned to rivalry and war. Crassus' hunger for glory ended in disaster. Pompey's shift to conservatism made him the Senate's tool. Caesar's brilliance propelled him to dictatorship. The first triumvirate, born of convenience, destroyed the balance of the republic. Closing image. Picture the Forum in the late 50s BCE. Statues of Pompey gleam, celebrating his eastern victories. Crassus counts coins in his palatial villa, dreaming of Parthian conquest. Caesar writes dispatches from Gaul, his legions cheering his every word. The republic still stands, but beneath the marble and glory, three men's ambitions pull it apart. Looking ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will follow the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, the battles that decided Rome's future, and the final unraveling of republican norms. The alliance of Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar, the first triumvirate, had once seemed an unstoppable force, bending the republic's institutions to the will of three ambitious men. Yet with Crassus dead at Carrhae and Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, lost to childbirth, the bonds of family and convenience dissolved. By the late 50s BCE, the Republic had become a stage for two rivals, Pompey the Great, champion of the Senate, and Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul. Their struggle would engulf the Mediterranean in civil war and bring the Republic to its breaking point. The tensions before the storm. By 50 BCE, Caesar's conquests in Gaul had made him immensely powerful. His commentaries spread tales of his victories, his legions adored him, bound by loyalty and promises of land. His wealth from spoils funded political allies and public spectacles. Yet in Rome, fear grew. Senators whispered of Caesar's ambition. Could he disband his army and return as a private citizen? Or would he march on Rome, as Sulla had done before him? Pompey, once his ally, now cast himself as defender of the Republic. In 52 BCE, amid urban chaos, he had been appointed sole consul, a sign of his unmatched authority in Rome. Though cautious, he began aligning with Caesar's enemies in the Senate, the Optimates. The Senate issued its demand: Caesar must disband his legions and return to Rome. To Caesar, this meant humiliation and ruin. Without his command, he would be vulnerable to prosecution by enemies eager to destroy him. Crossing the Rubicon. In January 49 BCE, Caesar faced a fateful choice. Obey the Senate and risk obscurity, or defy it and risk civil war. He chose defiance. With the words "Alia iacta est," the die is cast, he led the 13th Legion across the Rubicon River, Rome's sacred boundary. By doing so, Caesar committed an act of open rebellion. Civil war had begun. Pompey retreats. Caesar's advance was swift. His charisma and the loyalty of his troops brought town after town into his fold. Many senators, fearing his wrath, fled Rome with Pompey. Pompey withdrew to Greece, where he could gather resources and allies. His plan was to starve Caesar of support, using the Senate's legitimacy and the fleets of the eastern provinces. Caesar, meanwhile, secured Italy without bloodshed, then turned to Spain, defeating Pompeian forces there. The stage was set for a confrontation in Greece. The Battle of Pharsalus, 48 BCE. In 48 BCE, the two titans met near Pharsalus in Thessaly. Pompey commanded a larger army, supported by the Senate's authority. His cavalry outnumbered Caesar's, and his position seemed secure. Caesar, however, relied on discipline and cunning. Anticipating Pompey's reliance on cavalry, he placed hidden infantry behind his own horsemen. When Pompey's cavalry attacked, Caesar's men countered unexpectedly, driving them back. The balance shifted. As Pompey's line faltered, Caesar pressed the attack. His veterans broke through, scattering Pompey's army. Thousands were killed, others surrendered. Pompey fled to Egypt. The death of Pompey. Pompey's fate was tragic. Seeking refuge in Egypt, he was betrayed. Advisors to King Ptolemy XIII, hoping to please Caesar, lured Pompey ashore and assassinated him. His head was presented to Caesar, who wept at the sight. Pompey, once hailed as Rome's greatest general, had died in ignominy on foreign soil. Caesar in Egypt. Caesar lingered in Egypt, entangled in dynastic struggles between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra VII. Supporting Cleopatra, Caesar restored her to the throne. Their alliance became both political and personal. Cleopatra bore him a son, Caesarion. Even as Rome awaited stability, Caesar's adventures in Egypt revealed the breadth of his ambition. He was no longer merely a Roman politician but a figure shaping the fate of kingdoms. The mopping up campaigns. The civil war was not over. Caesar pursued Pompeian remnants across the Mediterranean. In Asia Minor, he defeated King Pharnaces of Pontus so swiftly that he declared, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. In Africa, he defeated forces loyal to Cato the Younger and Metellus Scipio at the Battle of Thapsus. In Spain, he crushed Pompey's sons at Munda in 45 BCE. By then, Caesar was unchallenged. He returned to Rome as master of the Republic. Caesar's dictatorship. With victory came power. Caesar assumed the title of Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. He initiated sweeping reforms. Calendar reform, introducing the Julian calendar, aligning the year with the sun. Debt relief, easing burdens on debtors. Expansion of citizenship, extending rights to provinces. Colonies, establishing settlements for veterans. Caesar sought not only power but transformation. He envisioned a Rome where provinces were integrated, where governance was centralized, where his vision replaced the old senatorial oligarchy. Yet his dominance aroused suspicion. Senators feared monarchy returning in all but name. Whispers grew of kingship, of tyranny, of the republic extinguished. The Ides of March. On March 15, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, Caesar entered the Senate. There, a conspiracy of senators, including Brutus and Cassius, struck. They stabbed him again and again, crying that they restored liberty. Caesar fell at the foot of Pompey's statue, the men he had defeated. With his death, the Republic's fate was sealed, not restored, but plunged into further civil wars. Reflection. The civil war between Caesar and Pompey was not merely a clash of men. It was the culmination of decades of strain, inequality, ambition, and the erosion of norms. The Republic's institutions, designed for a city-state, could not contain an empire. Ambitious generals, backed by professional armies, bent the system until it broke. Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar each played their part. Pompey's brilliance made him too great for the Senate to control. Crassus' greed weakened balance. Caesar's genius and ambition carried him beyond the Republic's limits. The Republic did not fall in a single moment but unraveled piece by piece, until civil war made monarchy inevitable. Closing image. Picture Rome after Pharsalus, after Thapsus, after Munda. The forum is filled with Caesar's statues, his face on coins, his name honored across provinces. Senators whisper in fear, citizens cheer in hope, veterans await rewards. And in the shadows, knives are sharpened, conspirators gather. The Republic has won victories abroad, but within its walls, it has lost itself. Looking ahead. Though this marks the end of our journey through the Roman Republic, the story does not end here. From Caesar's ashes would rise Augustus, the first emperor, and the Roman Empire itself. The Republic's rise and reign paved the way for empire, shaping history for centuries to come. And so, our long journey through the Roman Republic comes to a close. From the overthrow of kings to the birth of the Senate, from the Punic Wars to the rise of generals, from the reforms of the Gracchi to the ambitions of Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar, we have traced the Republic's rise, its triumphs, its struggles, and finally, its fall into civil war. The Republic was never simple. It was a place of ideals and corruption, of resilience and violence, of farmers and conquerors, of liberty and ambition. For nearly 5 centuries it endured, shaping laws, institutions, and ideas that echo even today. But in the end, its own successes undid it, as power concentrated in the hands of generals and the Senate could no longer contain the weight of empire. What remains is a story not just of Rome, but of humanity, how power is won, how it is lost, and how a people can rise from humble beginnings to shape the world. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the rise and reign of the Roman Republic. If you've enjoyed this series and would like to hear more immersive histories, designed to both teach and soothe, please consider subscribing to Background Historian. Your support helps bring more long-form storytelling to life, one episode at a time. Until next time, may your nights be calm, your thoughts at ease, and your imagination filled with the echoes of history. Background Historian out.